Well, hello. We're back. Slow chats are back. And I have to begin with some absolutely devastating news. I know that a lot of you are going to be heartbroken. It was always a topic of great controversy. There were haters, there were lovers, and no one was in between. And that is, of course, the subject of cigars. I used to do my slow chats with whiskey and cigars, and it was my way of decompressing and enjoying myself whilst talking to some of the most excellent people that you could possibly hope to talk to. But I've moved indoors. I've moved inside the house instead of being in the garage. There are reasons for that. You're going to start to understand more about what's going on as I enter deeper into what I'm calling phase 2. Those of you on my email list, you know what I'm talking about. This week is the beginning of phase 2 of my reinvention. And it began a year ago with a lot of planning and a lot of hard work in the background. And now, as of literally this week, that work is starting to hit the public eye. Last week, we teased you with a sample of what I'm doing with Rukshan. This week, we commence the new generation of slow chats. And I'm super excited because this is a man who I have the utmost admiration for, and I've wanted to interview for a very long time. I brushed shoulders with him briefly at an IPA event many, many years ago, and I went and said hi to him. And it was very obvious back then that he had utterly and absolutely no idea who I was or what I did, which is completely fine because let's be honest, I'm a niche weirdo YouTuber in the world of like libertarian politics. Like nobody knows who I am, especially back then. I mean, it was even worse than now. However, I did brush shoulders with him. I was there. I heard him speak, and I have just been voraciously devouring his latest book, Green Murder. Brilliant book. Got to be honest, haven't finished it yet. It is over 500 pages thick, but it's actually a very, very easy read. It just takes time. You've just got to have the time to get through it. So I haven't quite got all the way, but I got as far as I could. We're going to talk a lot more about Green Murder. We're going to talk about all kinds of different things, but there's a couple of things I need to do first. I don't have the cigars, but you know what? I do have a Good People Break Bad Laws mug. And see this little contraption on the inside? Those of you that read my emails, you'll know that I've got some coffee coming. And it's going to be a way that you're going to be able to support my work, save yourself some money, and drink some excellent coffee all at the same time. So I'm actually just finishing off making my little cup of brew that I'm going to be enjoying, some decaffeinated coffee. Sorry, I have to admit that. It is it's the unleaded variety. It's not the high-octane stuff. It's the unleaded variety. And, of course, I've got some whiskey. Why would you ever doubt me? I've got some Oban 14 to enjoy alongside this lovely coffee. This, I've got to say, this is so embarrassing, but actually this decaffeinated coffee tastes better than a lot of the like full berries coffee that I've had in my life. It's ridiculous. Okay. John Robertson says, Ian Plimer is a hero of mine. So he should be. He's a hero of mine as well. There is a lot going on, but there is one more thing I need to plug. Those of you that love to call me grifter and blah, 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 you're going to have a field day today. I have just earlier today sent out an email announcing the release of tickets to the Battleground Melbourne tour in cinemas. We're doing a what do you call it? A premiere, a cinema premiere for Battleground Melbourne at the Rivoli Cinemas on the 23rd of August. Tickets are essential. They are already more than 10% sold. Right, I sent out an email literally about an hour and a half ago, maybe 2 hours ago. I'm not quite sure. 10% of the tickets are gone already. So if you do want to get on board that, I'm going to post a comment here with the link. Otherwise, you can go to my Facebook page. I recommend you do that while you're watching. Don't wait till the end, because as more people get home from work and finish dinner and check their emails, I think those tickets are going to start to go really, really quickly. I know that others are going to start announcing the release of the tickets as well. RDA and others are going to be getting on board, sending it out to their mailing lists. So I suggest you don't wait. The link is in all of the different platforms, the Good Source, Topher Field, YouTube, and Facebook. Yes, that was what it was. It was the launch of Ian's book, Heaven and Earth. That's what I went to an IPA event for, was for that book launch, I believe. Or it was, if it wasn't the launch, it was shortly after that book was released. Brilliant. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. Judy says she's already got her tickets to the premiere. Thank you, Judy. I look forward to seeing you there. Okay, enough of the crap. Enough of the crap. I'm going to grab my cup here. I'm going to remove the contraption. Give it a bit of a squeeze. Get rid of that. My coffee is ready. My whiskey is ready. My guest is ready. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Ian Plimer. How are you?
Well, thank you for having me, niche weirdo.
It's a label I wear with pride.
That John Robertson watches the program while he's having a beer. Well, I do a lot of Zoom calls, especially late at night all over the world, and I have a cup like this. But what the viewers around the world don't realise, that this is what I'm drinking out of that cup.
Yes. No, yes.
So
it's not
I
a bad
joined
one
John.
either. It's not a bad one. That's
So,
yeah.
If it looks as if I'm drinking coffee to stay awake, it isn't. My favourite beer.
Yes. All right. So John correctly says Ian is a geologist. Geologists know more about Earth's climatic pattern than meteorologists at BOM, and yet he's called a climate change denier. It is ridiculous, my friend, and that is why this is such an absolute pleasure. Now, I do need to just give one more little bit of background before we dive in, Ian. For those that have only come across my work in the last 2 years, my audience has grown massively as a result of my work through the COVID-19 overreaction, etc. And there's a lot of people that think that that's sort of where I came from. They don't realize that before that, there was over a decade of work in issues like water management in the Murray-Darling Basin, on issues like taxation and free speech, and issues like climate change. And I had the unspeakable pleasure in 2013, if my memory serves me correctly, of interviewing Professor Fred Singer in the US. I flew over there and interviewed him and found him to not only be phenomenally knowledgeable, as you would expect of someone in his position, but to be genuinely one of those human beings that somehow makes you feel special. He just had that way and that manner about him. Unfortunately, he's passed away since then, some years ago. But I consider it an absolute pleasure and a privilege that I had the chance to speak to him while he was with us. And it remains one of the greatest feathers in my cap. So for me, coming back to climate change is kind of a return to form. It's a return to my roots, in a sense. Now, Professor, I kind of want to start off with, well, I've been reading your book, and you make a lot of amazing points in there, but I think we need to start at a fairly foundational level. And you refer to, and you allude to the fact that a lot of the current hysteria around the climate is changing, therefore it must be us that's causing it, is based on this idea of equilibrium, this idea of stability in the climatic system, that if it's changing, it must be us. But your work tells you very clearly that there have been some dramatic changes over the eons. So perhaps that's a good place to start. The climate change, has it always been changing?
Well, the equilibrium idea derives from the fact that this new religion, climate change, derives a lot of its thinking from the Bible. And the Bible implies that the earth is static, that we sinners make change to this planet. And the green activists, climate activists, whoever they are, have taken it up and run with it. And of course, that is contrary to the facts. And I don't have opinions. I have facts. And the facts are that for 4,567 million years, the Earth's planet has been changing. And it's been changing for many, many reasons. And the one thing that hasn't driven climate change is carbon dioxide. And the one thing that hasn't driven climate change has been humans on Earth. It's an appalling arrogance to believe that we pathetic humans can change major planetary systems. It's pathetic that governments think that they can twiddle a dial and change climate, especially when most of our climate is driven by the sun and by the Earth's orbit. And I would like to see legislation changing our Earth's orbit. It's pretty cold here in Adelaide over winter. Change the orbit. I want to warm up.
Listen, that's all very well and good, but clearly you are a lunatic, an outlier. 97% of all the scientists agree with whoever pays their bills. I mean, sorry, agree with climate change. Sorry, that was just a Freudian slip there. You know, we have this narrative. The media have done a really wonderful job. And I laugh these days. And I've just started not even hiding it. I laugh in people's faces now. Whenever someone talks about raising awareness of climate change, I actually literally laugh at them. And I say, honestly, is there a single person in the Western world who isn't aware of so-called climate change? Like, honestly, you're raising awareness. Awareness of what? We all know already. But we've been inundated with all of this dogma, and I call it that deliberately. I actually agree with you around the religion side of things. I think it has become a new religion, but we've been inundated with this dogma So why? What makes you think that you've got it right and supposedly 97% of all of the other climate scientists, so-called, have it wrong?
Well, let me go to your figure 97%. It's
Please
always
do.
very important to ask, where do numbers come from? How were they derived? And what is the evidence? That was a figure that came from John Cook, who was then at the University of Queensland. And he sent out a survey to 10,000 people who call themselves climate scientists. In other words, they couldn't get a job doing anything else, and they sponge off the taxpayer, and they frighten us witless. And if they, in fact, showed that the planet is dynamic and that what we're experiencing is nothing abnormal, they would be out of work. So he sent out surveys to 10,000. 3,000 replied, and he cherry-picked out of the 3,000, 77 replies, of which 76 say, well, my bread and wine on the table comes from believing in climate change. Belief is a word of religion and politics, not of science. And one said, oh, well, perhaps not. And that's how the 97% figure arose. Now, there's plenty of work, such as by Legatis and others, that shows that that is absolute total fraud. Now, in the physical sciences, if you commit fraud, you actually lose your job. But in the social sciences, if you commit fraud, you get promoted. And this was exactly what happened to John Cook. He got promoted and is now in some university in Lower Whoop Whoop in Arkansas or somewhere. So
I'm not sure that going to Arkansas qualifies as a promotion, Professor. I'm just no hate on anyone from Arkansas, but I'm not sure that that's a promotion. I had the pleasure many years ago on the same trip where I interviewed Professor Fred Singer. I also interviewed Donna Laframboise, the Canadian investigative journalist who wrote The Delinquent Teenager, which is a book all about the IPCC. And I learned from her and others all about, the Cook fraud. There was another attempt to claim 97% consensus, if my memory serves me correctly. And this was from an analysis of the extracts in a number of published and peer-reviewed.
Yes, they got 97.1%.
Yes, and my understanding is that people who have tried to replicate the same results have been unable to do so. There are some very strange anomalies around the words that were searched and weren't searched for, etc. Is that something you can speak to?
Well, yes, of course. That is almost the whole case with all climate activist science, that you cannot replicate the work. Now, science is married to evidence, and one must be skeptical of how the evidence is collected and the interpretations based on that evidence. And that evidence must be repeatable, and it doesn't matter whether you do it in Patagonia or Pakistan, you must be able to repeat that evidence. And once you have that evidence repeated, then you have conclusions which might form the basis of a theory. But if there's new evidence, new calculations, new thinking, then you have to change your conclusions. Now, the climate activists do not acknowledge that there is a past, that we have history, that we have archaeology, that we have geology, which is very much contrary to the conclusions they come up with. Now, if they were true scientists, then they would say, okay, the coherent criterion in science is that if there's one body of science that disagrees with my theory, I have to reject the theory. That
or at least revise it.
Now, this is where Fred Singer for a long time, and I met Fred at a Heartland conference in Chicago. He was a great man, and you mentioned how he makes you feel very important. Another great Australian does that, and that's Geoffrey Blaney. When you talk to Blaney, he has a wonderful speaking method to make you feel the centre of the conversation. I've met Donna a number of times. The last time was a very cold winter in London, and her book is very much one of experience. So there's a lot of people out there who have got a huge amount of experience and knowledge, yet we are totally and absolutely ignored by the media because we don't follow the narrative. We use evidence, and we are not frightened. And if we're not frightened, well, fine. Life goes on.
Now, there's a really good question here that I want to bring up from a viewer. Here we go, from Karen. And this is a good question, both for what it is, both because of hopefully your answer, but this use of a single data point to say, well, climate change must be real. It's not necessarily what Karen is saying, but she's saying, how do you explain then, if climate change isn't happening, how do you explain the heat waves of England happening right now? Well, instead of me giving my answer, we've got Professor Ian Plimer with us. So, Professor, how do you explain the heat waves that we see and are certainly very, very front page news whenever they happen?
Well, for someone who has spent most of his time in the outback, I would disagree. It's a heat wave. Yes, it's a tad warm, but a heat wave is when it's 47 during the day and the temperature collapses to a freezing 38 at night, and it's like that for a month or two on end. And that's certainly what I experienced in my early years in Broken Hill. The second thing is that you have to understand how the measurements were taken, whether they were adjusted, and when they were taken. Now, that temperature, let's say it's 40 degrees in Cambridge in the UK, which I think was the highest temperature. That is a high temperature since measurements were taken from about 1850. However, if you start looking at measurements that were taken, say, in the 1500s, then of course temperature is going to be increasing. If you start the measurements at 1250, the temperature has been decreasing. If you started the measurements when the Vikings were raping and pillaging, then the temperature has gone up. If you start the measurements in Roman and Greek times, then the temperature has gone down. If you start in the maximum period of our interglacial, about 4,000 years ago, then temperature has gone down. So the key question is, when did you start measurements? How did you do the measurements? What adjustments have taken place? And records are there to be broken. And I don't see that one swallow makes a summer. And that's what we're being told to believe, that 1 or 2 hot days in England is apparently the end of the world. Well, at the same time, we've been experiencing pretty cold and very wet conditions in southern and eastern Australia. So,
coldest start to winter in many, many decades.
My word. So if you want to start looking at climate as a global phenomenon, you then have to say, well, what's happening elsewhere in the world? I don't have a problem with temperatures suddenly spiking. That is quite normal. What we do see is, over the history of temperature measurements and over the history of using proxies, we have periods when we get sudden high temperatures or sudden low temperatures in a long-term trend. The long-term trend for the last 4,000 years is cooling. Within that, we've had periods of warming, such as the Roman warming, periods of cooling, such as the Dark Ages, periods of warming, such as medieval times, periods of cooling, such as in the Little Ice Age, and periods of warming in the modern warming since 1850. So I don't have a problem with the occasional hot day. I pray to have a few of those here. It was 18.5 degrees here in Adelaide today. Not too many clouds in the sky. It was fabulous. That's a perfect winter day. It's the sort of day that we should be having all the time in winter.
So Pyro to be on YouTube asks, Ian, what was the peak average temperature on Earth during the warm periods between previous ice ages? Let me reframe the question slightly. You do, in your book Green Murder, talk about the fact that actually what we're experiencing right now is, as I understand it, 5 degrees cooler than some of the peaks that we've observed in the not too distant past.
Yeah, that's correct. We are significantly cooler than the medieval warming. The medieval warming went for about 300 years. It was so warm we could have 2 crops a year in Europe. Wow. The excess wealth built the great monasteries, universities, and castles. It was a wonderful time. It was about 5 degrees warmer. It was probably 3 to 5 degrees warmer in Roman times. And we know that from crops, the Romans kept very good records of where they put grapes, where they put olives, and their salt harvests. And we know that the Romans grew wine grapes in northern Yorkshire. Now, England does grow grapes in Kent and elsewhere. They make wine from it, but you wouldn't give that wine to a starving dog. It's absolutely shocking. So we do have fairly good proxies and fairly good records that shock horror, temperature rises and temperature falls. And this is cyclical, and it's driven by many features that are unrelated to human activity.
So why is it then that all of this is a matter of public record? How come people just don't seem to know this? Why isn't everyone just going, hang on, guys, hold on. We all learnt in school. We all know from our university. We all know that actually it's been warmer, etc. All these data points, you're absolutely correct. Why don't we know this stuff?
Well, there's a couple of comments I make. Firstly, there's a fundamental philosophical question you always have to ask. How do we know what we know? And that's married to evidence.
Mm-hmm.
In schools, we've had a dumbing down over the last 50 years of our education system, where we are not encouraged to be curious. We're not encouraged to ask questions. We're not encouraged to be disruptive and say, no, I've read or seen something contrary to that. So the education system has a lot to blame. But I think there's some other features. We're absolutely hardwired to fear. This is why we have adrenaline. This is why we have certain responses, the fight and flight responses. We are hardwired. Now, we don't have some monster trying to attack us right now. And so it's very easy to prey on people, to get them frightened, to have them, to use this hard wiring, to have them fearful of something. And it's to be fearful of something you can't see, you can't smell, you can't touch, such as radioactivity, such as carbon dioxide. It's the perfect weapon. And the last point is that this global warming hysteria is really a Western phenomenon. Now, I spend a lot of my time working in the third world. Most of my work in recent years has been done in South America. Now, in the parts of Ecuador where I work, people don't care about global warming. They want to know where their meal's coming from. They want to be able to have their kids fed. They want to make sure that they have electricity so their kids can do their homework to end up with a better life. So this is a disease of the affluent Western world where we are very wealthy, we are incredibly well off, and we have to feel guilty. And this guilt is intertwined with paying penance. This guilt is intertwined with indulgences, which we all pay in our carbon taxes. So it's a complex mixture of poor education systems, hardwiring of our biology, and remnant Christianity in very, very wealthy countries.
Well, I want to come back to this religion idea, because this is something that I've been saying for a while, and I've seen other people touch on. But you really go for this. You really you're not backwards in coming forwards. I don't think that comes as a shock to you. But talking about the fact that green ideology has gone well beyond a genuine concern for actual measurable environmental harms, and has now become its own religion, its own worldview, its lens through which you experience your entire existence. Is this, and you've mentioned Christianity a few times, so let me explore that for a moment. Is this actually symptomatic, perhaps, of the rejection of Christianity and more traditional religions, and I guess the void that has been filled by other religions in the past now finding a new way to be filled?
Well, a couple of things. Firstly, green activism and climate change has got nothing to do with the environment. If it had something to do with the environment, you wouldn't have wind turbines slicing and dicing life. You wouldn't have solar panels completely sterilizing huge amounts of land. You wouldn't have the debris which cannot be recycled from turbines and from solar panels just dumped, leaching out toxins into soil and waterways. This has got nothing to do with the environment. This is to do with power. And this is the power that unelected people want to exert over you and me. And that power it's a bit like some of the bishops of 1,000 years ago. These people, you could not question. They had absolute power. They had the hotline to God. And we're in the same situation. We have people who are in the UN, who are in the EU, who are anonymous, sitting somewhere, that we pay. And we pay for these people to destroy our lives. They don't particularly care about the environment. This is all about power, and it's all about money.
So one of the things that I find really fascinating, again, I'm coming back to the climate change issue, having touched on it in some detail, but as a layman, I'm not a scientist. I don't have scientific training, so there's only so deep that I can go. But I did go as deep as I could, what's that now, 9 odd years ago, with the 50 to 1 project that I did back then, interviewing a number of different eminent scientists and leaders in other disciplines, and getting into the science, etc. myself. There is this fascinating problem where we've had all these predictions made on the basis of the climate change models, etc. There'll be more hurricanes. There'll be, droughts will get worse. Wildfires will get worse. The temperature will go up, etc. And consistently, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I believe that there's not a single one of those predictions that has unequivocally come true. There's many that have unequivocally not come true, and some that might be debatable, but none that have actually unequivocally, they predicted this and it clearly happened. And yet somehow, the less evidence there is, the more dogmatic these people become. What's going on?
Models are not evidence. Models are attempts to try to understand a natural phenomenon. And you are constrained by what you know to be able to put into the model. If you think that carbon dioxide drives global warming, you put that into your model, and these are the models that are not in accord with the 30 years of measurements that we've got. There is a Russian model that doesn't use carbon dioxide, and that is a very, very good model of what has actually happened. Now, we've got 30 years of models, and we've also can compare those models with measurements where we can measure from satellites, which are tampered with less than ground measurements, and these models just don't work. I have challenged the modelers to do the model backwards. Just do the model backwards for 2,000 years. Let us see what we can see with a model that's in accord with the Little Ice Age, the medieval warming, the Dark Ages, and the Roman warming. It hasn't been done, and it won't be done for a very good reason, because the model doesn't work. Now, models are not evidence. They are a very, very naive attempt to try to understand how the world works. Now, in geology, we look a lot at models, and we create a geophysical model, which is 3-dimensional, and a geochemical model that is 2-dimensional, and we test this model with a drill hole. It is very, very rare that the model works. Normally, we find that it doesn't work, and we amend it, and we test it again with another drill hole, and it might not work again, and we test it again, and eventually those who are paying for the drill holes say, well, you've had your fun, the model doesn't work, go away. So we're always testing models, and we have this rotary lie detector, which is called a diamond drill, and we check the evidence. Now, I think it's very, very foolish of models to make predictions, but scary predictions, which you can make that might happen in 100 years' time, are wonderful, because you'll be dead, and you don't carry any responsibility for it. And you will get a lot of publicity for it. And so you will keep getting funding, and you will keep getting research done.
So Tehillim, who's a regular viewer of mine, welcome, mate, good to see you, has just said, okay, I need to see about getting this book from Ian. So where can people go to get this, Ian?
The publisher is Connell Court Publishing, C-O-N-N-O-R, Connell Court Publishing. They are in Brisbane. The book is published in Brisbane, printed in Brisbane. I will not use publishers where books are published or are printed abroad. These create jobs in Australia. All you've got to do is do a web search. Just do greenmurder.com, and that'll direct you into it.
Vicky, just for you. Just because you asked. Okay, excellent. Well, I highly recommend it. I highly commend it. I haven't quite finished it yet. Tremendously easy read. But may I commend you, the depth of scholarship in something that is still easy to read is just such an impressive accomplishment. I read a lot because of what I do. I'm a political commentator. I have to read a lot. I read a lot of scientific research, a lot of news and articles, a lot of press releases and public policy and legislation, etc. And to get something that is such a compelling combination of easy to read and yet with deep, genuine scholarship is very, very rare. So I tip my hat to you, Professor.
Well, thank you. But I've had criticism from previous books that they're too scientific.
They're right.
Like Heaven and Earth. What I wanted to do in Heaven and Earth was kill an ant with a sledgehammer with overwhelming information to show that we are just being conned. In this book, I took my time. I wrote it actually when I was living in Melbourne. I was in Melbourne all of 2020, getting treated for cancer. And so I had a cannula in, and I was reading all sorts of stuff and had a laptop there, and in the clinic I had basically they set me up in an office.
Yeah, wow.
I could have internet, I could have my computers, I could have nurses zip in and out, giving me injections and doing all sorts of things. So that was absolutely wonderful to be constrained in Melbourne. And rather than sitting around moaning, you might as well do something. And then I was back in Adelaide last year, and I finished it off, working at a slow pace. But and I think it shows that I haven't rushed this book, that it's a bit clearer in language than some of the previous books.
It's tremendous. If I can just sort of pursue that more sort of personal angle for a moment, without having asked in advance, where are you at with your cancer fight?
Well, I haven't had treatment since Tuesday. I take 39 drugs every day. Half the morning I spent nauseated, so I lose the morning. That's when I do my reading and on stuff that comes on email and on the web. It's a very aggressive melanoma that got into the brain, into the lungs, into the gizzards, and it wasn't picked up. And the first time it was, the second time it wasn't picked up, but it was picked up pretty early. So I think I'm going to be one of the lucky ones. But basically, you do what you do. And I hear, and this is from an extraordinarily reliable source called John Robertson, but I hear that drinking beer is the antidote to cancer. So cheers to John.
That wouldn't happen to be this John Robertson. Obviously, we have not only amazing guests, we have not only amazing guests on this show, but we have incredible health experts as viewers, it turns out. Who knew? Now, you touched, as we were discussing things about, 10 minutes ago or so, you touched on the way that the Earth station's temperature record isn't reliable. The surface station's, temperature record isn't reliable. Now, that's something that's always been of interest to me ever since I interviewed Anthony Watts, who did the Surface Stations project. But could you fill us in? Because I'm sure a lot has happened in the 9 years since I had that chat with him. Why can't we trust the numbers that are coming out of these surface stations? Surely they would be the most reliable. They're right there. They're just measuring the temperature.
Well, Anthony Watts has a wonderful blog site, What's Up With That? And I recommend people to look at that. Anthony is still very active. He's always posting stuff on Facebook. I see him every day with something from the Chico area where he lives. He's always posting.
Yes.
He is a trained meteorologist. For a long time, people have been concerned about temperature measurements. And the reason for this is that they were originally taken in fairly isolated areas. And these might have been airports or out in fields. But with the growth of suburbia and with the increase in airport traffic, we are now finding that measuring stations have hot fumes blowing on them, have back reflection from concrete. Some of these measuring stations are in the middle of roads, and the corrections are at best naive. And so the first thing is we've had a change in demography such that the measuring stations now have not been moved. And if they have been moved, there hasn't been a correlation between the old and the new. Second thing is that most of these measuring stations are in Western countries, especially the US. The third thing is in the really remote high latitude areas, we lost a very large number of measuring stations when the Soviet Union collapsed. And we don't have enough Arctic measuring stations. And the last and most disturbing point is that these measurements get homogenized. Now, Jennifer Marahasi in this country, and you should talk to Jennifer, she'd be a great guest. She has done a lot of very good work on this. And she has shown that in rural areas such as Rutherglen in Victoria, these measurements have been adjusted to make it look as if we have a warming trend. Now, that to me is fraud. A primary measurement should remain as a primary measurement. She's got the same sort of data for Darwin and Burke and many other places. So we've got the surface record, which is incomplete. It doesn't cover the oceans. It's one-dimensional in that we are measuring temperature. We are not measuring the flow of heat, nor are we measuring the three-dimensional temperature in the atmosphere. Satellite measurements do that. Satellite measurements and radiosonde balloons give us a three-dimensional view of the atmosphere. Balloons mainly deal with the air above continental areas, but satellites deal with the whole planet. And if you want a reliable measurement, then you need to use satellite measurements, and there's huge pressure to tamper with the satellite measurements and to make them in accord with the doctored ground measurements. And those who control the satellite systems are strongly objecting to this. Now, what we see in the temperature measurements that have been adjusted is that all of a sudden they don't look like the past natural measurements where you have cycles where temperatures go up, temperatures go down. They're smooth, and we're getting warmer and warmer. We're all going to fry and die. And as a scientist, whenever I see different measuring methods, I get suspicious. When I see straight lines, I get suspicious. When I get, I see trends that are going up and up and up, indicating we're all going to die, I get suspicious. So for many reasons, I don't think we can trust surface temperature measurements.
Well, we saw a clear example of that in Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth. And if my memory serves me correctly, there was actually a lawsuit in the UK where some people challenged it on the basis that it was not scientifically accurate. And they actually won that case. But in the judgment, they weren't able to stop it from being shown in schools. But they proved to the satisfaction of a court of law in the UK that there were a number of things within that documentary that were not scientifically accurate. And one of them, of course, was the infamous hockey stick, which is a classic example of what you're talking about there, where they've created this lovely, just bumbling along type of temperature record where the medieval warming period has disappeared and the Maunder minimum and its effect on temperature has all disappeared. And then all of a sudden we've got this rise in temperatures at the end, something that is just pure fantasy and always was. But Hayley King is watching on Facebook, and she's got what I think is going to be a question that a lot of people have in their mind, particularly if you're newer to this subject. Why are they changing the data? How could they possibly justify changing these surface station records? I mean, they must have some sort of an explanation that makes it seem okay.
A couple of things. Firstly, Al Gore is the first billionaire from frightening people witness about climate. A school governor in the UK challenged his film, and the court ruled that there were 12 scientific errors in that
12,
film,
was it? Thank you.
And that they should be raised every time the film is shown. The third thing is that Al Gore is so concerned about the way the world's going, he was suggesting that we were going to have a 20-foot sea level rise. As a result, he bought a waterfront property, as did Tim Flannery, as did Obama. So
Obama, yes.
Hypocrisy is a word that I use to describe these people. Now, to answer the question, why do they change it? I think this is all about people getting funded. There are a large number of people in universities, in the CSIRO, in the Bureau of Meteorology, who are eminently unemployable. And if these people can frighten us witless, then they obtain public funds. The Bureau of Meteorology has something like $1 million a day of taxpayers' money to spend. Now, that money has to keep coming. The Australian Research Council delivers huge amounts of money for climate, and the Australian Research Council gets directives. I sat on the Australian Research Council for many years. We were directed in John Dawkins' day to fund any science that is associated with the fight for cancer. So if you wanted to study ingrown toenails and could show that they were related to cancer, you got funded. In the case of climate, if you can show that there's a forthcoming disaster and your research might expose or stop it, then you will get funded. And I've always argued, and I argued in this book, it's a case of follow the money. There are a lot of totally, absolutely bloody useless jobs out there. And there is an art form in getting funded for useless jobs.
Yeah.
And this is part of the reason for doing it. I think the second reason is it's glory and power. If you're at a cocktail party and someone sidles up to you and says, "What do you do?" Well, I normally hesitate and look around and look at the ceiling and say, well, I don't normally say this, but I'm in the arms business and I buy and sell armaments. And that generally pisses off someone who's annoying me. But if you're a climate scientist, you can say, well, I'm a climate scientist and I'm saving the world, and you should be very grateful, and by the way, my glass is empty and can you go and fill it up? So it's all about the glory. It's all about
Yeah.
power. It's all about
Yeah.
money. And these are very, very human characteristics.
Mm. I think, in a way, my audience would be very, very aware of what's been happening with the overreaction, in my opinion, to the coronavirus, and a lot of these same human flaws, I think, drove a lot of that overreaction. All of a sudden, there were these public servants and people that were previously unremarkable and largely unnoticed that were thrust into the limelight and had their moment to play Superman and save the world. And what we saw with COVID was that psychology playing out in a more compressed time frame. But I have to agree with you. I think that psychology is at work on a multi-decadal time frame within.
Oh,
within
yes, very much so. And in my experience from producing thousands of graduates, my very best graduates went into the mining and exploration industry. The second best graduates went into academia. And the ones who were really weak went into government departments.
Yeah.
And I think you see that in medicine. And I think we saw that in COVID. People who really cannot tread water are those who ended up as head of a health department, and they had to die in the sun. They had the cameras on them, and they were telling us, "Oh, don't touch that football."
Yeah.
These people
right.
obviously don't have a life.
Oh gosh, it was painful. It was just painful to watch. Now, a question without notice. I apologize. I meant to check this with you beforehand, but
no. We don't have that agreement. Any question is fair go.
Do you happen to have come across Professor Ainsley Kellow in your journeys?
University of Tasmania. Ainsley for about 6 weeks.
Oh, okay.
I know Ainsley from the University of Tasmania well. He's a wonderful writer, a very good speaker, and Ainsley and I performed at an IPA function at Noosa. Oh, it must have been about 6 weeks ago.
Well, then may I leverage your relationship with him to extend an invitation to have him on my show as a Slow Chat guest? Because this book has been in my possession for nigh on 10 years now and remains one of the single most influential books on the way in which I analyze issues and subjects and how I try and understand the behavior of the people who are on the other side of the issue from me. This is called Science and Public Policy: The Virtuous Corruption of Virtual Environmental Science. I cannot recommend it highly enough. I recommend it ever so slightly less than Green Murder, of course. But when I do have Professor Ainsley Kellow, I will, of course, switch the order of the recommendation. This changed my life. And I don't say that about very many books. This was a absolutely phenomenal book. And what he does in this book, and I'm sure you're well aware of it then, Professor, I'm pleased. He talks about essentially he dives into the psychology without it intending to necessarily be a psychology textbook. He dives into the psychology of what causes good people with good intentions to start publishing bad data. In some cases, data that they even know is bad, but in other cases, data that they may not necessarily have consciously intended it to be bad, but it is. It's terrible data. It lacks any sort of rigor, and it cannot be classified as scientific. To what degree is what Professor Kellow discusses in this book playing out in the Greens movement today, do you think?
Oh, very much so. But I don't think the Greens movement is concerned about data at all. The Greens movement is concerned about your purse, power, and absolute control on everything. You know, what you fart, what you eat, whether you travel, how much you travel. And one of the things you can be very certain of is the Greens wouldn't have read a book like Ainsley's. They wouldn't read Green Murder. They just don't read. And they don't need to read. They know it all, because what happens is that I am battling facts against feelings, and feelings are always going to win. And the only way we will get a change is when people feel things in their pocket. So we have quite a battle, because we are not hard up. We are quite wealthy in this country. No one shot at me today. No, I haven't starved today. In fact, I can afford a little excess with the fluid here. Life's pretty good in this country. And so people can say, oh, yes, you know, let them take that little bit. And this is a salami approach. One slice after the next, after the next, after the next. And all of a sudden, where are we? We're broke. We've got no freedoms. We've got no ability to do anything. And that's the path we're going down.
Yeah, look, it is concerning. One of the observations that I've made in the past, and I want to run past you for you to agree, disagree, expand on, squash as you see fit. There seems to me to be a substitution where people who have good intentions, and I default to assuming that people have good intentions. I'm not one of these people that defaults to the assumption that there's some Bond villain out there necessarily, although I have to say that the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab is doing an extremely good job of challenging my my position on that. However, that aside, the vast majority of people that are involved in, for example, raising awareness about climate change believe their own BS even as they live as hypocrites, in my personal opinion. But I noticed something very, very strange a while ago, and that is they didn't seem to be measuring improved environmental outcomes on the basis of their policies. There's no one's really running around measuring improved environmental outcomes because of wind turbines and solar farms. I mean, if they did, they would very quickly find that there weren't improved environmental outcomes. What they seem to be measuring is worse economic outcomes, and they seem to be satisfied with that as a proxy. There's almost this zero-sum thinking that they've fallen into, where they're saying, well, if it's good for humans, it must be bad for the environment. Humans only flourish at the expense of the environment. Therefore, if it's bad for humans, it must be good for the environment. And that's much easier to measure. To what degree, is it fair to say, this is my question, is it fair to say that the Greens movement as it expresses itself today is actually an anti-human movement?
Yes, very much so. But it's worse than that. There's some very good evidence out there to show that the very slight increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide has led to a greening of the planet.
Yes.
It, together with genetic engineering and better fertilizers, has led to better crops, much better yields, less land being used to feed people. Even though the global population has increased, we are feeding people with more calories from much less land. The second thing is that we have 20,000 generations of humans that have lived on this planet. It's only the last 4 generations where the average longevity has gone from 25 to 78 years. That's the global longevity. That's not for the Western world. We have not seen a change like this ever in the history of the planet. Things are getting much, much better. The third thing we see is that the countries that are environmentally devastated are poor countries and socialist countries. The countries that have enough spare money to attempt to rectify previous environmental problems are the wealthy countries. And so it is the wealthy countries that have enough money to be able to do something about the environment. Now, you see this with India. India now is starting to be able to care for the tiger. It couldn't do that 50 years ago. And so this is the exact opposite of what the environmentalists want. And I think the climate activists want. And I think in many ways it is an attack on capitalism. And they don't seem to realize that capitalism has actually helped the environment. Initially, as we see in China and as we saw in Europe and the UK and the US, capitalism destroyed a lot of the environment. But once there's enough money and enough awareness, then this is addressed. And that's what's been happening for a long, long time in our country. Now, our keyboard warriors generally live in cities. They live in apartments. They don't work in the bush. They've never spent years in the outback seeing how farmers are really caring for the environment, because the farmer will pass on the property to the next generation, and they don't want to pass on something that's completely clapped out. They actually care for the environment. And we have had environmental care programs in this country in the outback since the 1930s. I give an example, a place that I go to generally once a fortnight or so, Broken Hill. Now, Broken Hill had huge problems with shifting sands and dust as a result of tree clearing. This was for building of fences. This was for firewood. This was for wood for cooking. This was for smelters that were only there for a couple of years. And it was so bad that in the 1930s, the mining company said, okay, we're going to do something about this. And they built a green belt around Broken Hill. What happened was that the shifting sand stopped. The rainfall went up very slightly, and the winter temperatures went up a little bit, and the summer temperatures went down a little bit. That was in the 1930s. So the green movement in Australia was started by mining companies who actually saw real problems and had practical solutions. And when I lived in Broken Hill in the 70s and 80s, You could go to the local mining companies and say, you'd go to their nursery and say, well, I want one of these, one of those, one of those, one of those. And you would get free plants that were suitable for a desert environment, and they would give them to you. That policy went on for at least 50 years. Now, that is true environmentalism. Now, I bet you those keyboard warriors, and they don't watch your program, they know everything, but I bet you those keyboard warriors wouldn't have a clue. The people who I know who own stations are very, very caring of the environment. And what they're really concerned about is the station next door. If that's brought up by national parks or national sparks and wildfires, as they call them, then they know that feral animals are going to come out of that place. They know that fires are going to come out of those places. They know that some of these places are bought up for carbon credits and then shut down. So they get taken over by feral animals. They get taken over by feral weeds, and it's locked up for 20 years. The great environmentalists in this country are the family farmers. Maybe some of the corporate farmers are not so kind to the environment, but certainly families are.
Yeah. And I've seen that with my own eyes more recently doing work on the Murray-Darling Basin and the mismanagement of water there, spending time out on people's farms. The amount of water that is on paper, according to the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, consumed, wasted, not available to the environment, is actually sitting in channels or on rice paddies. And you just have to go there and you can hear the frogs, you can see the birds, the fish, the insects, the amount of life that is just attracted to that. But that doesn't count because the environmentalists didn't put it there, the farmers did. So therefore, just we ignore the positive aspects of that. It strikes me how many of our, or how, to what degree the Greens movement has actually caused a lot of the problems that they're now trying to supposedly fix. An example that jumps to mind for me is now they're saying we can't have coal-fired power plants and we have to cut carbon emissions. But actually our carbon emissions, I'm using their language, our carbon dioxide emissions, they would actually be lower than they are if the Greens movement hadn't stopped us from building nuclear power plants, just as one example.
Well, very much so. Following on from your Murray-Darling comment, for more than 50 years, I've been crossing the Darling and Murray systems. And 2 weeks ago, I crossed the Anna branch between Wentworth and Broken Hill.
Yes.
And in more than 50 years, I have never seen the Anna branch with so much water in it. Most of the time, there's no water in it. So there is a huge amount of water coming down the Darling system at present, and that we know. We know that there are cycles when the floodplains are completely covered. I know that from the 73, 74 rains. We had massive flooding that covered the floodplain, the Darling floodplain at Wilcannia, and it was covered for 9 months. You couldn't drive across that road between Wilcannia and Cobar. In terms of the Greens creating problems, we have the foundations for a 560 megawatt power station at Jarvis Bay on Commonwealth land in New South Wales. That was stopped. If we'd had that power station, we would have had nuclear power and it wouldn't have been a problem in this country. We would have been onto the 4th generation. The footprint of a coal-fired power station is 1/300th of that of a solar power station, generating the same amount of power, but doing it only when the sun shines. So the Greens murder the environment, hence the title of the book, Green Murder. In terms of trying to reduce emissions, I don't know why you'd want to reduce emissions of plant food. Carbon dioxide is plant food, and the most important scientific point of the lot, well, yeah, I'll get onto the second one in a minute, but the most important scientific news of the lot is that no one has ever shown that human emissions of carbon dioxide drive global warming. Now, if someone could show that the human emissions drive global warming, then you have to show that all the natural emissions, which is 97% of the total, don't drive global warming. That's never been done. Now, the whole premise is based on something that is unproven. And when people talk about emissions and having to lower our emissions, you have to ask the question, why? Why do we want to starve plants? Especially as a lot of the Greens are vegetarians and vegans. Why do they want to starve plants? Now, what have the plants done? Let them have food. And a plant does not know if that molecule comes from coal or comes from degassing of the earth.
Yeah.
And even more so, coal is just compressed sunlight.
Mm-hmm.
It's sunlight from
I love that. I love that.
260 million years ago.
I was chuckling so much when I got to that in your book. I was like, I've never thought of it like that, but it is brilliant.
And that's carbon dioxide that was removed from the atmosphere. And we know that at that time, we had a massive decrease in atmospheric carbon dioxide. We've had for the last 500 million years a decrease in atmospheric carbon dioxide going into shells, going into plants, going into sediments. It is still decreasing over the long term. If we halve the amount of atmospheric carbon dioxide, then all plant life dies. So it is beyond me why we want to pick on a poor innocent molecule, and our emissions are one molecule in 85,000 in the atmosphere. Why would we want to do that? Why do we think that changing 1 in 85,000 is going to change the whole planet? It's a bit like being a Collingwood fan at the MCG. 1 out of 85,000 of you is barracking for Collingwood, thinking that your noise will change the course of the game. And Collingwood are pretty used to getting thumped, so it's not going to change the course of the game.
Something that you just said partway through there, you made reference to the degassing of the Earth. Now, I found this really, really interesting in your book, because you make the point that even the idea that humans are emitting 3% of all of the atmospheric carbon dioxide that is being emitted is actually just a model. It's not something we can measure. They're modeling it. They're trying to guess as best as they can. And you make the point that we really don't know how much CO2 is actually being released into the oceans, into the ocean floor. And really, we actually can't even be sure that that 3% figure is accurate, let alone all the other figures that derive from that. So as a geologist, can you school me a little bit on some of these natural processes that are going on that are releasing unknown quantities of carbon dioxide?
The Earth has had 3 atmospheres in its 4,567 million years. The first atmosphere was rich in ammonia, had some hydrogen and helium, which nicked off into space. It had a little bit of carbon dioxide in that atmosphere, and that was a pretty toxic atmosphere. But that changed. And the Earth's second atmosphere was rich in carbon dioxide. And during that time, when we had a carbon dioxide-rich atmosphere, we had some massive ice ages. And these massive ice ages started when there was up to 100 times more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than now. So the geology is telling us, well, you don't have runaway warming from carbon dioxide. You actually have other processes going on. And the third atmosphere we had was driven by life. And life has been using this carbon dioxide, algae and terrestrial plants, and converting carbon dioxide into the carbon which goes into the cellulose in wood and the release of oxygen. And so we've had fluctuating but oxygen contents over the history of time. And over the last 500 million years, we've been sequestering carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Yet the oxygen content's been going up and down. In fact, we have cycles of carbon dioxide and oxygen which are almost the inverse. And there's a chap at the University of Tasmania, Ross Large, who's been doing some work on trace elements in sulfides in sediments, and he's able to look at how oxidized oceans were over the last, say, 3,000 million years. And he's able to show these wonderful cycles of sulfur, oxygen, and carbon dioxide. So we have these huge cycles working together and pairing each other off. So our Earth's atmosphere has evolved from the planet degassing. And we know these gases come from deep in the Earth because we see them on Mars. We see them on the moon. We see them on all of our rocky planets. We see them on the icy planets where there's a lot of methane. And the Earth's early atmosphere had a lot of methane. We can measure degassing. Every time we have a volcano, we have gases released. And these gases have a chemical fingerprint. And some of that is, say, surface water, which gets into the hot rocks. but others are gases that come from very deep in the planet, and they have a very different chemical fingerprint. So we know the Earth is degassing. We don't know by how much. We know that there are about 1,800 terrestrial volcanoes. We can see them. We have measuring stations there, measuring temperature, measuring tilt of the land, measuring earth tremors, measuring the gas chemistry. And that's done for safety reasons, because we don't want to have thousands of people killed by a big eruption. And we can predict eruptions pretty well now. We can't predict earthquakes very well, but we can predict eruptions. Now, there are 1,800 terrestrial volcanoes. They are a rock type which doesn't dissolve much carbon dioxide. But we've got at least 3.5 million volcanoes on the sea floor. And we know from cooking up rocks with carbon dioxide that those rocks dissolve up to 13.5% carbon dioxide. So you've got a molten rock, and 13.5% of its weight is carbon dioxide.
Wow.
Now, you don't see those eruptions. They take place on the ocean floor. They take place in a few places like Hawaii and the Galapagos Islands, etc. But we don't see them. We have no measuring stations. And so all we can do is deduce from our experiments that we are leaking out huge amounts of carbon dioxide from these rocks. Now, we've got a few wonderful clues. For example, just north of New Zealand, we see liquid carbon dioxide on the ocean floor. We see in shallow water a lot of carbon dioxide bubbling out of these volcanic rocks. But in deep water, you don't see bubbles because it immediately dissolves in this high pressure, very cold, saline water. And ocean currents eventually bring that to the surface where it warms and degasses. And losing that gas to the atmosphere is just taking volcanic gases on a very long trip before we lose them to the atmosphere. So all of our gases in the atmosphere, our major gases, except for oxygen, derive from degassing of the planet. Now, oxygen's a really interesting gas because we get oxygen in our atmosphere due to life. It's due to biochemical reactions involving methane or involving carbon dioxide or both. And this is why in our search for life on extraterrestrial planets, we try to line up a star outside our solar system and with a planet in front of it. And that starlight going through the planet's atmosphere, we can measure the spectrum of that starlight going through the atmosphere, and we can work out if there's oxygen or more, it's easier to measure ozone. And that gives us a clue that there's life out there. So there's a lot of work being done on gases coming out of planets, trying to work out if these gases give us a clue of life. If we stand back from Earth and look at the gases being released from Earth, we're releasing a little bit of helium. And some of that helium is from the breakdown of uranium, but some of that helium is the original helium from the cosmos. But the main gas we release from planet Earth is hydrogen. And we are losing hydrogen from the core of the planet and from water rock reactions on the ocean floor. And if you wanted to look at our planet from space, you wouldn't see the water, you'd see the hydrogen. So the atmosphere is something that is ignored by the atmospheric scientists because they're looking at today's atmosphere. They're not looking at the evolution of the atmosphere and how the atmosphere reacts with everything. And I'll give you one example. On a Thursday, 2,500 million years ago, we had a very interesting process that took place. And that was when we had bacteria starting to react with methane and with carbon dioxide, and they start to release a little bit of oxygen into the atmosphere. Our atmosphere then was the Earth's original atmosphere, rich in methane, rich in ammonia, rich in nitrogen with a bit of carbon dioxide there. And as soon as the oxygen content started to build up, we see that we had a rusting of our rocks. They went from greenish rocks to reddish rocks, and that's because we rusted the iron. The dissolved iron in the oceans precipitated to form the great iron ore deposits of Western Australia. And so here we see a reaction between life, the atmosphere, the oceans, and rocks. And that is how the planet works. And you cannot look at climate by just looking at the atmosphere. You've got to look at what we know goes on, and that's a reaction between the rocks, life, the atmosphere, and water. And once you look at that, especially over time, then you can start to understand that our planet is very dynamic. Its past climates have been driven by processes some of which we understand quite well, some of which we don't understand very well at all. But we certainly cannot be dogmatic in saying that traces of a trace gas drive a major planetary system. Now, that's the answer. I got no idea what the question was.
No, that's okay. There's been some. You open that drink. I'm going to talk just for a minute because there's been a couple of good questions I want to touch on. But before I do that, I want to say, while you were talking about the degassing of the planets, all I had going through my head on repeat was The Lion King when Pumbaa and Timon are talking about what the stars are made out of. And one of them says to the other that they're fireflies sitting on the ceiling way up there. And the other says, I thought they were great big balls of gas burning billions of miles away, to which the reply comes, Pumbaa, to you, everything's gas. And I just had that thought of, you're measuring all the gas coming out of the planets. To you, everything's gas. Excellent. Now, there was a question. There was someone seeking a clarification on the 1 in 85,000 reference that you made when it came to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So if I can attempt to answer that question as I understand it, and then if you correct me if I get this wrong, what you're reflecting on there is that carbon dioxide is, I think it's about 430 parts per million in the atmosphere at the moment, which works out to be roughly 1 out of every 85,000 atoms, particles, whatever you want to call it, in the atmosphere. Is that what you were referring to?
I was referring to Australia, where we've got 1.3%.
Yes,
of that
3%.
Of our the annual emissions, which are adding parts per million to the atmosphere.
Gotcha.
So basically, what I'm saying is, no matter what Australia does, we are tampered with 9 parts of 5/8 of bugger all, and it's going to make no difference because 50% of the world's emissions come from China, Russia, and India and the US. No matter what we do, we are going to make no change. And if we changed and led by great example to show the world how pure they are, they would just laugh. They'd say how stupid you are, destroying your economic system to show that you're pure. We should leave that to New Zealand to do.
Okay. So I used to have a lot of conversations with people about climate change in the 90s when the temperature was still rising. If my memory serves me correctly, it's been a while since I've looked at it, but I think 1998 still stands as the warmest year on record, if my memory serves me correctly. But it certainly was.
Wait a minute. How do we measure it? Where do we measure it? What were the corrections? And when did we start the measurements?
Okay. So let me answer none of those questions. And simply say that in the 20 years or 23 years, 24 years since, we've basically seen a sideways movement of the reported average Earth temperatures. There really hasn't been a dramatic movement one way or the other. And it gets quite interesting. And I am going somewhere with this to my next question, Professor. But if I can segue for a moment. I would have these debates with people, and when I point out that the Earth's climate hasn't increased, or the average temperature hasn't increased in the last 20 plus years, they're very quick to say, oh yes, El Nino, East Indian dipole, Southern Ocean oscillation, various other things that they would try and use to say, oh, this is having a short-term damping effect that is countering the effect of this rising CO2 that we know is warming the Earth. We just can't see it happening in front of us. So what I always say in reply is, oh, well, that's interesting because I thought you said that the CO2 was the driving factor in the Earth's climate. That's in the driver's seat and everything else is minor. But if these other things can combine to completely counter the effect of CO2 over a 20 plus year period, well, then I'm starting to question this idea that CO2 really is in the driver's seat. And of course, as the years have passed, that question has gotten harder and harder for them to respond to as the atmosphere or the temperature stubbornly refuses to start climbing again. But here is my question for you. If CO2 is not the primary driver of climate, what is? What are the things that we should be looking at to actually try and anticipate what might happen in the future?
The simple answer is the sun. The sun.
That's heresy. I have to warn you, Professor. I'm sorry. That is heresy.
And we know that the sun has cycles. These are on 22 years, 217 years. We are currently entering a grand solar minimum. started about 2020, will finish about 2053. And coupled with that, we have orbital phenomena where we're close to or further away from the sun every 100,000, 40,000, 20,000 years. That's been known for only 100 years. So I would like to see governments change the orbit of the Earth such that we'd have a constant climate and we wouldn't have to worry about warming and cooling. But your comment on short term is interesting because we are in what is called the pause. Now, if you want to say, oh, that's short term, let's look at the long term. The best long term to look at is the record we've got. You could look over the last 1,000 years or 2,000 years or 10,000 years or 10 million years. And that shows that climate always changes and is cyclical, and that we're in a long-term cooling trend, and we've been there for quite a long time.
Yeah.
If we want to argue that carbon dioxide emissions by humans drive global warming, then it's never been shown. And if you did, you'd have to also show that the ocean emissions don't. But if you did, the best place to look is in the ice sheets, because as snow falls, it captures a little bit of air. That's kept as a bubble in the ice. When we drilled the ice, and there's some 20 holes that have been drilled into the Antarctic ice and fewer holes into Greenland ice, we can drill these holes, and various layers in the ice are from volcanic eruptions. So we can date that, and we can work out the accumulation rate of the ice. And then we can extract a little bit of that ice. And from chemical fingerprints in the ice and chemical fingerprints in the air, we can work out temperature. And so we can work out, and it's been done time and time and time again, that every time we had a natural rise in temperature in the polar regions, some 650 to 1,600, perhaps even 6,000 years later, we had a rise in carbon dioxide. So it's not that carbon dioxide gives us a temperature rise. It's actually a temperature rise gives us a rise in carbon dioxide. Now, we know that anyway from chemistry. It's called Henry's law. And we know it. And I've only got this here to demonstrate to you
of course.
how it works.
Science. Such is your commitment to science. I do appreciate it.
Very much so, the commitment to science. Now, if I pour this fluid, which is releasing carbon dioxide, into there, it will keep bubbling as it warms up, because carbon dioxide has an inverse solubility in water. What that means is if you're putting sugar into a cup of tea, the hotter the water is, the more sugar you can dissolve. But in the case of carbon dioxide, the colder the water, the more you can dissolve. So as this fluid warms up, then it's bubbling off carbon dioxide. So too with the oceans. As the oceans start to warm up, they bubble up carbon dioxide. They lose carbon dioxide. And so we know from chemistry, we know from ice core drilling, and we know from geology that it's temperature that drives carbon dioxide. Now, we have 3 independent lines of evidence, yet we get told the exact inverse, that increasing carbon dioxide drives temperature rise. How come that lie gets perpetuated? Well, it's a good news story. Good news stories don't sell. Good news stories don't pay for research funds. We've had this information, the ice core information, for 20 years. We've had Henry's law for over 100 years. That information is not eureka type science. We know it. It's been established for a long period of time. It doesn't create jobs for people to sit there and frighten us witless. And all this talking made me very thirsty. So,
yes, indeed.
Carbon dioxide, you cannot have bread, wine, whiskey, beer, soft drinks, or anything without putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So, if you want to have a carbon dioxide free world, go and live in a cave. Don't light a fire to warm yourself. And after the 13th consecutive wet day, when you've been unsuccessful at hunting, tell me about climate change.
And you better stop breathing as well, because that's contributing to
carbon dioxide. 4% we exhale. And that's because we eat. We eat carbon-based foods, and we oxidize that carbon-based food because we breathe in air and it's got oxygen in it. And we breathe out air with less oxygen in it. And we oxidize the carbon into carbon dioxide, which we breathe out. That is a normal metabolic process. If you don't like exhalations of carbon dioxide, there's a really simple solution: drop dead.
However, if you do, your body will rot and release an enormous amount of greenhouse gas in that process as well. So it really is a bit of a lose-lose situation for the
Well, the
real
main
hard.
greenhouse gas is water vapor. So don't get fooled with carbon dioxide or methane. That's
Okay.
the main greenhouse gas. And
Yeah.
we don't get governments legislating against oceans evaporating water.
Funny that. It would be a little bit like legislating against gravity. It's
Yes,
probably
exactly.
not. You're not going to look good by the time you finish that. Okay, so the sun, primary driver of climate change. That I have discussed the coming grand solar minimum on slow chats previously, and I'm a layman, a layperson. I'm not a scientist, and so I have to listen to and read and try and understand as much as I can what the actual scientists are saying. Could you give us your thoughts on what are the implications from your point of view, with your knowledge and your history, with whatever level of confidence you wish to express it with? What do you think the coming grand solar minimum actually is likely to mean for us?
Well, I can't critically analyse the work that the main worker has done on this. She's at Northumbria University in the UK. But I can look back in the past and look at previous grand solar minimum where things have been pretty miserable. The last one we had was the Maunder minimum. This is when we had the ice fairs on the Thames and on the Seine rivers, where we had skating on the canals in Holland, where we had barbecuing oxen on the Thames, where we had the great hoarfrosts that the Dutch masters painted, where we had people dying like flies. People don't die in hot weather, they die in cold weather. And
Yes.
so if it's anything like the Maunder minimum, we are better prepared for it than they were 300 years ago. We are better prepared because we have better heating, we have double glazing, we have more abundant food, we understand diet much better, but it would be savage, and it would be people living at medium latitudes that haven't taken the precautions against the ultra cold weather. Those people say living in Finland, it wouldn't make much difference because some properties I've been to in Finland had triple glazing, so they would survive it. So we would find that the wheat belts of Canada, Russia, and the Ukraine moved south. They'd moved south about 200 kilometres. That would mean there'd be far less wheat exported from those countries. Most of the Canadian exports go to the Middle East. We would find that Australian wheat exports would decrease because in very cold times it gets windy, and we have inland Australia covered in sand dunes from great anticyclonic winds, and you can see that they were swirling around from the shape of the dunes. We also had salt lakes, we had devegetation. So the planet would be windier, it would be cooler, it would be less productive, there would be less food, and the people living in latitudes from about the US-Canadian border, anywhere north of there, it would be even colder. And it's pretty miserable. I mean, when you look at Canada, why do they all hug the US border? Because it's a little bit warmer than up in Fairbanks or in Alaska or in northern Canada. So what it would mean is that we would have to have very efficient, very reliable energy systems, exactly those that we're trying to destroy. We would have to have very efficient food and transport systems, which we're trying to destroy. And we would have to have much better building construction. In this country, we do not build for the ultra hot weather or the cold weather. We have houses that leak. I'm here in an old house. You can see behind me stone walls. And I mean, this is cold as charity down here in my study. But we would have to actually improve our building in Australia. So give me the warmth anytime. Cold weather kills. And the Maunder minimum killed people. We know that in previous grand solar minimum, we had warfare and we had the plague, and the plague weakened populations, and so we're likely to have pandemics again. And we've had an epidemic lately. It certainly wasn't a pandemic, and I mean that's just child's play compared with if we had the plague.
Yeah, if we had the real thing. So Paul asks a great question here. It would be a wonderful line of conversation going forward. And just by way of background, I'm an enormous admirer of Hans Rosling, and unfortunately, I feel like he's the one that got away. He's a man that I will never have the pleasure of ever interviewing. He's passed away now, but what an incredible intellect and an incredible communicator. And I learned from him through YouTube videos. His YouTube videos are still very much there and well worth the time to find and watch. Just how much better the world has actually gotten in the last 100, 150. You can measure it in different ways, starting at different points in time. But just how phenomenally we've improved in every metric. And Paul has a question here that I think is reflective of that. Isn't Russian wheat growth increased significantly over the last 10 years? Well, I think wheat growth and productivity per hectare has improved dramatically globally in the last 10 years and 50 years and 100 years. You touched on that in your book. Could you tell us a little bit about just how far we've come in a very short amount of time?
Well, in the book, I have very early on, I think the first chapter, I've got a table looking at all the parameters that we can measure to show that things have improved. And I guess the best is looking at longevity. And human longevity has increased enormously. Once countries have big political changes, as we see currently in Venezuela, as we saw in the change from the Soviet Union to Russia, longevity goes down. And longevity goes down, certainly in Russia, from alcoholism and poor diet and et cetera, et cetera. But in Venezuela, there is actual starvation going on. And that's the present that socialism gives you, is starvation. So I guess it's
weight loss. It's mandatory weight loss.
Everything. So the best matrix would be looking at longevity. Now we can measure that, and we've got very good statistics on it. We've got extremely good statistics worldwide on how many people die and what their age was. And we are living in the luckiest country ever. Now, that luck we can destroy, and I think we're doing it right now. We are living at a time when we can get an education, where we can get a job, and we can live well into our 80s, unless, of course, something extraordinary happens. So we couldn't be living at a better time to be a human. Don't give me the good old days. They were not. I'm 76 years old very soon. I lived a very frugal life. And that life the Greens would love. We would walk out of rooms and turn off lights. We would collect spare bits of string and metal and wood because we'd use them sometime. Our lawnmower was a sheep. We didn't use a hydrocarbon-driven lawnmower. We didn't have reticulated electricity. We didn't have a flush dunny. All these things came later. But the Greens would admire me for having looked after the environment. Well, my argument to that is I've done that. I've looked after the environment in the 40s and 50s. Give me a break. I want to now live my life the way I want to live it. I've done my bit. I've saved the planet.
Yeah. You've earned your stripes. There was, of course, the very ill-fated attempt, I believe it was out of New Zealand, where some idiots who didn't think this through very well put up a website where you could calculate your carbon dioxide emissions, and you were given a certain budget that they'd somehow calculated as to what each human being could emit. And they pulled it down after a teenage girl tragically took her own life, having been on the website and come to the conclusion that she'd already used all of her carbon dioxide, and therefore really that was what she should do. And there were other factors involved in that. She wasn't necessarily an entirely healthy individual besides that, but these ideas have consequences. And one of the concerns that I have as we enter a new religious age, a new piety, a new paganism that is rising, is that ideas have consequences. And if these people get their way, the utopia that they imagine is going to be hell on earth. I just can't see how life gets better under their rule. It doesn't. The rejection of capitalism, the rejection of productivity, and the anti-human kind of approach that they bring to all of our problems. How do we debate this? I mean, we live in democratic countries. I don't want to live in a dictatorship, and I don't even want a dictatorship that happens to agree with the things I like. I don't want a dictatorship that's a pro-capitalist dictatorship, even though I think capitalism is good. I would much rather be in a democratic system, in a democratic country, but that means we have to win the contest of ideas. How do we do that? What are the ideas? What are the arguments that are worth knowing that can help us to actually win this contest of ideas?
I think to win the contest of ideas, and I agree with you, we have to battle ideas. At present, we are having people of my view, your view, shut down by the mainstream media.
Yes.
We don't preach doom and gloom. We force people to think. We force people to justify the consequences of their actions, so the mainstream media doesn't touch us. But to win the contest of ideas, you have to have a knowledge of the past. Now, in one great green scheme, we see at present in Sri Lanka, where all of a sudden they wanted to go organic.
Benjamin Roberts is making
example.
exactly that.
Now, we have moved from wallowing in mud and cow dung to actually having genetically modified foods and synthetic fertilizers developed more than 100 years ago. We've moved into having very efficient farming. Why go backwards? In Peru, about 30 years ago, there was a move not to chlorinate drinking water. After all, chlorine gas is highly poisonous. Well, that's quite correct. But once you oxidize chlorine gas and use chlorine to kill bacteria, then you have clean water. Now, sometimes that clean water has a slight smell of chlorine. So Lima was the first to feel it. They got rid of chlorinating water and they got cholera. We have some wonderful examples around. These ideas do have consequences. We're seeing it currently in Germany. Oh, we're going to go clean and green and live off wind and live off solar. Well, things go wrong when you have a wind drought. Things go wrong when solar panels are covered in half an inch of snow. Things go wrong when Mr. Putin doesn't like to send you gas. And all of a sudden, they cannot draw enough hydropower from Norway, cannot draw enough nuclear from France, and they've got to go back to what they had before, which made Germany a great economic force, and that is go to their abundant coal reserves and use nuclear. And so we've seen these mistakes time and time and time again. And I see that in this country, the only way we will get a significant change is if people's electricity bills become so high that there is a revolution. The community doesn't care if people my age die, but if a child dies because of a lack of food or lack of electricity or dies on an operating table when the power goes off, there will be a change. So the only way I can see we will change in this country, where there will be consequences for these ratbag ideas with people with degrees in political science changing the whole electricity system. The only way I see we'll get a change is when there is really, really severe social hardship. We have electrical engineers who are pushed out of the game. They know nothing about grids. They know nothing about generating power. Of course not. They built our whole system. And now we have political activists and people with political science running the whole process. So I think we have to start with massive political pressure from the cost of our electricity and keep that pressure up, because I'm old enough to remember the times when we had very poor electricity. We didn't have enough of it as a child in Sydney, and we had new power stations built. These were coal-fired power stations, and bingo, we had electricity. And furthermore, it was cheap. And furthermore, it was reliable. And furthermore, you could keep refrigerators going for 24/7. You could keep a supermarket going all night, keeping its food cool. And now we're going the exact opposite direction. We once had cheap, reliable electricity. And we have to go back to that. If we don't, we are just trading jobs. And we are trading jobs to those who are selling us the rope to hang ourselves. And that's China selling us the wind turbines and selling us the solar panels.
Well, I've spent a little bit of time, a few weeks at a time, in a few different places with unreliable electricity. Probably the two most notable would be Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea and in Caracas in Venezuela. I was there for a week with my wife in 2015.
Wow.
And
what the hell would you go to both places for? Port Moresby is one of the scariest places on planet Earth. It's on the same level as Johannesburg, in my view. I spent a lot of my life traveling to dodgy parts of the world, but why would you go there?
So Port Moresby, I was on a humanitarian trip bringing sort of medical education to the slums. So we were actually deliberately going out into some of the absolute worst parts of that city and, teaching people crazy things like when you get bitten by a dog, wash the wound, wash your hands before you eat food, crazy stuff, crazy stuff. In Caracas was actually the most dangerous place on earth outside of a war zone when my wife and I were there. To find a more dangerous place on earth, at least as far as the official statistics were concerned, you had to go to Iraq at the time. And so we spent a week there. A friend of mine was getting married, and we decided we were going to go over there. And it was phenomenal, and it bent my brain in so many ways. It was really one of the most wonderful experiences in a really perverse sort of a way. Because it brought home everything that I'd been saying about the importance of capitalism and the importance of individual incentives to do better and to make more money and to improve your situation, etc. What's my TV wants to turn itself off. No, you silly thing. All of that was just it became very real because suddenly I was looking at the consequences. And there's a couple of really seminal moments. I remember a chap clearly walking home from work wearing a suit and a tie, dumpster diving, looking for scraps of food in dumpsters to take home to his family, because even though he was employed, he still couldn't afford to actually feed his family properly. I've got photographs of the lines that would go for blocks of people trying to get into a supermarket in the hope that they might have some butter or some eggs or some milk or some flour. The people who organized the wedding were very fortunate. They were quite wealthy people and they had international business. And so they were able to earn money in US dollars and get paid in Bitcoin and things like that. So they were in an incredibly privileged position compared to most. But even so, they had to begin buying things for the wedding 6 months before the wedding, just in case it wasn't available closer to the day. That's funny, St. Tova. Can you show us some of those photos? I wasn't prepared to talk about this, so I don't have them handy. But I did do a talk, which you can find on YouTube, called Condoms, Toilet Paper in Venezuela. And I did a talk about my time. We smuggled condoms into Venezuela, my wife and I, 420 of them or 470 of them or something like that. Not all for personal use. We didn't quite use all of them. So yeah, just a really bizarre part of the world, and it really brought home ideas have consequences. One other story.
I find that very interesting. I, as I mentioned, spent a lot of my life in the third world. And I mentioned Venezuela in the first chapter of the book. I go into a country that was a very, very wealthy country from its oil revenues, which were state-owned, and they totally destroyed it. And for me, one of my great formative experiences was in 1977. And it took me a couple of years to organise, but I bought a combi van in Frankfurt and I drove through East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Poland and the Soviet Union, and then came out into Finland about 2.5 months later.
Wow.
And I had a look at the communist part of the world, and it was really quite interesting because the one thing that I saw there was fear. There was fear everywhere. People wouldn't look you in the eye. And in a combi van, sometimes late at night, someone would come up and scratch on the door and want to have a chat about what it's like outside. The black market was huge. And to change Deutsche Mark was quite a dangerous thing to do, but we did it. You'd queue up in, say, Minsk or Smolensk or Moscow for food. So you'd be in a long queue, and there'd be a shop that would sell butter and fish hooks. Then you'd have to get into another queue where you could buy powdered milk, and there might have been nuts and bolts in that shop. Then you'd have to get into another queue where you'd line up and you get some tinned corn, and there were blankets also for sale in the shop. And so you spent your whole day hunting and gathering. And that was a country where there were no telephone books, an obscure alphabet, and an obscure number system. Immediately after that period of time, I then spent a few months working in Iran, in Baluchistan, based out of Mashhad. And that was in the Shah's time. And it was in the last 2 years of the Shah's time. And that was late 77, early 78. And I saw exactly the same systems. Exactly the same systems of controlling people by having shortages of food, by having no phone books, by having an obscure alphabet, an obscure language, and people were scared. People were always scared. And certainly in Iran, I could smell a revolution coming because I was working in the high Khopetdar mountains. You could hear the boys out there practicing. You could hear machine guns. It was quite scary. And so that was a great education for me about totalitarian systems and how they can control you with shortages, how they can control you with the use of language. And we see some of these characteristics now in Australia, the use of language, the use of, and we will get shortages of food in this country. If we get foot and mouth disease in this country, the vegans would probably cheer. They might even try to bring it into the country, but they wouldn't have any food either. But if we get foot and mouth in this country, we are in serious trouble. We have food shortages, and that means greater control of everything you do. Every penny you spend, every calorie you buy is controlled. So I was quite curious, and I've been curious all my life about things, which is why I started life as a scientist. I was quite curious about how the Soviet Union operated. I'd read a lot of work about the Soviet Union. I'd read, of course, Karl Marx. I was interested to see how this wonderful nirvana operated. And it was really quite appalling. And you crossed from Soviet Karelia into Finnish Karelia. Same language, same soil, same people, and the wheat in Finland is twice the height of the wheat in Soviet Karelia. And that was because of Mendelian science that goes right back to the 20s and 30s. It still affected the Soviet Union.
Instead of Lysenkoism.
Oh, yes. So crazy scientific ideas have consequences. And the consequences are they kill people. And that's exactly what we're seeing in Ceylon. This is why I've called the book Green Murder, because crazy green politics kills people. And you might be next on the list, especially if you're my age.
Well, Paul, remind me later to get back to this question, because that is a good question, but I don't want to break this thread that we're on. So remind me, if I sound like I'm wrapping up and we haven't talked about nuclear power for Australia, then remind me. I want to touch on what you commented on with the fear side of things. What was really interesting in Caracas was there wasn't a huge amount of fear. Not to the same degree as I saw in China. So I spent 2 weeks in China and in Guangzhou in the south of China, and then in Hong Kong. And a little bit like what you described, crossing the border out of Russia and into, what was it, Finland, with the wheat being twice as high. The contrast in the way people behaved at the most basic level with their interactions with each other. In Guangzhou, people were combative. Normal conversations were held in a heightened state of argumentative, an argumentative level. Horns from cars didn't stop until 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, and then they started again at 6. We're on the 14th floor of a high-rise hotel just because it was cheap, and it was just horrific. We couldn't sleep. The building was very badly built. Even with all the windows closed, it sounded like the windows were open. People were suspicious. Even we showed up at the airport, and it was myself, my wife, my son, and my mother-in-law who was there to help look after my son. I was there on business. And so we all tried to pile into a taxi, but the taxi was quite small. And so we ended up with suitcases on our laps. The boot just wasn't big enough to actually hold, all of the luggage. And the taxi driver didn't want to take us. He wanted to force us to use 2 different taxis, and we refused. And we said, no, we can all fit. And so he's driving along, and I remember, and this was my first experience, we've just landed. He's driving along, and there are these gantries over the highways, the freeways, that have a myriad of cameras. I mean, we've got cameras over highways, and we shouldn't, but we do. But this was on a whole other level. There were clearly cameras that were long lens, and there were cameras that were wide angle, and they had multiple angles of every single thing that happened. And I remember him trying to hide his face so that he wasn't visible on those cameras as he drove underneath with
Mhm.
passengers with luggage on their knees, etc. And I thought that's really odd. It's curious. And then we started to walk around and try to meet people and try to ask people for directions or questions or how do we do this or that. I went to get a SIM card to put into a burner phone that I brought with me. That was my plan for how to sort of be able to make phone calls and things like that. Impossible. And you walk into a phone shop there, and there is a government employee paid full time to be sitting there inside that room, making sure that no one gets access to the internet without the government knowing what their identity is, without them having to prove their identity. No one gets a SIM card unless they've gone through the forms and the processes. And then we crossed over into Hong Kong, and the difference, I mean, like you said before, same people, same soil, but 100 years of British rule, the difference was just incredible to see.
Mhm.
And so it was a combination, I think, of my experience in Venezuela and then my experience in China and Hong Kong and seeing the fear in China for their totalitarian rule, seeing the suffering in Venezuela for their capitulation to socialism. And that was really the beginning of a process for me where I went, you know what, I don't care if some people don't like me. This stuff actually matters. This stuff is actually important, and it really does actually make a difference. Hence why I've become much more hard-lined and vocal in the years since.
Well, I mentioned my 1977 travels in the Czech Socialist Republic and Poland and etc. And I go to Poland quite a bit for various reasons. But after my 1977 trip, I went back to the Czechoslovakia, as it was then, still communist, and I was to give a course to the Czech Geological Survey and to Charles University. And that course was organised by, in my field, one of the best known and greatest scientists in my field. And he had invited me to come there and give that course. And I gave it. It was one where there's simultaneous translation, which is a very hard thing to do. Those were the days when you had 35mm slides. And it was a week-long course. In that course, there were 4 or 5 goons sitting there, obviously not interested in what I was talking about, but observing everyone.
Yeah.
At the end of the week-long course, I then was dragged up in front of the director of the Czech Geological Survey with my colleague, a great scientist, and the director was going to give me the feedback on the course. And my friend was absolutely beside himself. He was shaking with fear. And of course, the director was not a scientist. He was a party hack. Anyway, he was chatting to my wife and I, and then went to a special cabinet and bought out a $600 bottle of whiskey. And that was a signal that the course had gone well. And we had a nip in the middle of the day. And I've always loved teaching. I think I've always been an outstandingly good teacher. And I knew that my friend's life was in play if I gave a bad course. And that was a challenge I gave myself. Anyway, I got a reward for that course. And the reward was the most bizarre reward one can ever have. You know, one might have thought you would have got a bottle of the Czech firewater like Bekarovka or some wonderful Czech porcelain, but no. My reward was a visit to a Russian uranium mine in Czechoslovakia.
Wow.
Now, this was an eye-opener. This was a closed city. The Russians had no uranium deposits at that stage. They pillaged the uranium from the Czechoslovakia, and we were traveling in this sort of Czech variety of a combi van. And my wife asked my colleague about Jan Palach. Now, Jan Palach was in the Prague Spring in 1968, was a student who immolated himself as a result of, on the Charles Bridge, as a result of the Russian invasion in the spring of 1968. Now, our driver almost broke his neck swinging around to see who asked this question. The driver was obviously security. Jan Palach just does not exist in the world. They've written him out of Czech history. and one of our kids is called Jan for that reason. So
Wow.
you go to this country and you see that the party hacks just control everything. Now, this worries me a little bit about this country. We have hacks who are activist bureaucrats who we do not elect and who can put their thumb on everything and control everything. And if you step out of line, you're gone. So
believe me, I've lived it. I know.
Yeah, I'm very much aware of the background. And so I saw it firsthand with my great friend. And then I brought him out to Australia. And when he left Czechoslovakia in 1984 to come on a tour of Australia to look at various geological features, the communist government kindly lent him $10 to spend a month in Australia. I passed the hat amongst various mining companies, and we raised a considerable amount of money, which then we put into a German bank account, such that whenever he wanted to leave the Czech Republic to go to an international scientific conference, he actually had money. I mean, that's the way the system worked. And a bit like Trudeau getting into people's bank accounts, everything they controlled, every single thing. Anyway, I went to these wonderful Russian uranium mines, and that was like stepping back into the 1500s with the safety conditions in those mines. It was amazing. But that didn't matter. The workers were Czech and the owners were Russian.
That's right.
Something impossible. So I learned very early on about the great pleasures and joys of communist and socialist systems.
So when I was 7 in 1989, just to give you an idea of what a spring chicken I am, my family had, my dad was self-employed. He was a preacher, pastor of a church, and made very little money, but he also did voiceovers to try and make money. And he had a really good year. He picked up some really good contracts, and we had money. And my parents, to their credit, decided instead of blowing it on things, that we were actually going to travel for 3 months. And so as a family of 7, 5 children and 2 parents, we spent 3 months, 6 weeks in the US and 6 weeks in Europe in 1989. Well before people were ordinarily doing it, let alone large families were ordinarily doing it. It was the one moment in my parents' life where they had a bit of money, and that's how they chose to use it. And I think it was a wonderful thing. One of the places we went to, and I believe it must have been, I don't know, it must, I mean, the Berlin Wall came down actually while we were in Europe in 1989, very late 1989. But we went to a salt mine. Let me get on with the story because I'm struggling with where it was. But
Krakow?
It must have been Eastern Europe somewhere.
Yeah, Krakow. That's some major salt mines there.
Yeah, I don't know. But I remember as a kid, I'm 7 years old. Don't judge me. I was 7 years old. I was a kid in a candy shop because in order to get down, they actually had wooden slides that had been built where you'd hang your leg over each side and you're sitting on kind of there's 2 lumps of wood and you sort of get a butt cheek on each one. And there's a bit of a void in the middle that kind of keeps you aligned, legs over each side, and down you go. And these things that had so many workers slide down them for so many decades, they were the most polished things you could possibly imagine. And so you got into these overalls that they provided you with to go down into the salt mines. And I don't remember a single other thing except for how awesome it would be if your workplace had slides. Now, I'm not sure it was quite as much fun to the people that used to work in the salt mines as what it was for a 7-year-old kid who was visiting for a day.
Well, you got to climb out. That's the problem.
Well, you got to come back out again. No, so okay, we've covered a lot of ground, and I'm loving where we're going in terms of, I guess, the lessons of history and the lessons that we can see in other parts of the world. I do want to ask a bit of a selfish question, though. In your travels, do you happen to have come across Václav Klaus, and do you have any connection with him?
Yes. He wrote a foreword to my book about my earlier book on the Greens. I also was with him on a lecture tour in Australia.
Amazing.
And I was also with him in Prague for the launch of one of my books, which had been translated into Czech.
Wow.
He wrote the foreword I think for my book, How to Get Expelled from School. And that was translated into Czech.
Yeah.
And his chief of staff then later became the Czech ambassador in Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia.
Mm.
He contacted me, and one of my books, Not for Greens, was translated into Mongolian.
Wow.
So,
do they have a big Greens movement in Mongolia?
I don't know. But this chap, the ambassador, then was pretty switched on, and I think Václav Klaus was one of the few European leaders who actually stood up for his country.
Yeah.
And his country didn't want to go down the path of madness and sending them broke. The Czech Republic, he formed and split off Slovakia. That has quite a lot of coal deposits. It could have a nuclear industry from its own uranium mines. It doesn't use them, but it does have some reactors.
Yeah.
So, and it's an absolutely lovely country. And the Czechs have a wonderful way of thinking, and they were able to defeat communism in their heads with a book that was written in 1923, I think it was, by Jaroslav Hašek, and it's called The Good Soldier Shrek. And there are two translations of it. I've got both of them in my Broken Hill house. The early translation cuts out all the smutty bits, but the latest one I bought was the smutty version. Now, Shrek was a soldier in the First World War, and he did everything to avoid going to the front. And you have to wonder whether he was dumb or very, very smart, but he got himself into all sorts of predicaments. He was showed dumb insolence all the time, and any order he took literally, and he could convert it around in language. And the Czechs used that as their Bible to handle the Russians when the Russians occupied Czechoslovakia. And my friend Miroslav, who I spoke about earlier, he learned English from reading the English version of Shrek. He learned French from reading this French version, and German from the German version. So it is one of the greatest books about how to quietly just unscrew the lock washers and loosen up the bolts, with handling total dumb insolence from people who are committed to a cause but don't really understand how the world works. It was the book that kept the Czechs alive, and so I'm able to quote bits of it. It was written by Jaroslav Hašek, who was an alcoholic. Let me have a drink. He was an alcoholic, and he did it from a restaurant bar called Ukalice. And Ukalice, wait a minute, I can see a prop here. This is all unplanned, of course. This is one of the placemats from Ukalice.
Wow.
And that is where that book was written. And so this is the Bible for actually screwing up the system.
I love it. The selfish reason for my question, when I was doing 50 to 1, so 50 to 1 was born out of Lord Christopher Monckton actually approaching me. The phone rings, I answer it.
Oh, yes.
And he says,
voice.
Yes, this is Lord Christopher Monckton. He didn't call himself Lord. He said, this is Christopher Monckton. And I went, I know your voice, and you're either a very good faker or this is actually Christopher Monckton, and I have no idea why you would be calling me. A mutual acquaintance had given him my number, and he pitched to me 50 to 1, which was essentially a series using the IPCC's own numbers to show that according to them, it's 50 times more expensive to try and stop climate change than it would be to simply adapt to it as and if it happens. And I went ahead and did that. That's why I interviewed Professor Fred Singer and Donna Lofrumbar and Anthony Watts and so many others. However, I reached out to Václav Klaus and said, would you be willing to be interviewed by me? Thinking there is no way he's going to say yes. I am an absolute nobody YouTuber from Australia. And
he loves this country.
The former president of the Czech Republic. He's not even going to get it. Like, he won't even see it. Some receptionist is going to read it and go, bin. Well, sure enough, he gets back to me. He says, actually, yes, it would be my pleasure. I'd love to be interviewed by you. And unfortunately, I was never able to raise the budget to do the European leg of the trip. So I missed out on Lord Lawson, Václav Klaus, Christopher Monckton himself, etc. There were a bunch of people. We had to choose between getting to the US or getting to Europe. And I chose the US leg of the trip, US and Canada, with the people that were there. And so Václav Klaus has a very real sense of the one that got away for me. I was very much looking forward to that interview. So I'm sorry to do this to you twice in one interview, but I'm going to be asking you in a follow-up email after this whether there's any chance of a.
I don't think there's any problem with that.
Okay.
There was a quote that I saw yesterday by Klaus from October the 19th, 2010, and it says, "It seems to me that the widespread acceptance of the global warming dogma has become one of the main, most costly and most undemocratic public policy mistakes in generations. The previous one was communism." And that's Klaus, who lived under communism. He's a great man. He's a great man. Now, I've got to make a note for...
Oh, no, look, I will send you an email annoying you about Professor
Ainsley Tello and Václav Klaus. Klaus would do it. He's a great man. And
would be amazing.
Yeah. And Prague is, well, it was a beautiful city. I think it's been destroyed by too many tourists, but I have a great love of music, a great love of opera, and I have been to the National Theatre in Prague to see Don Giovanni in the same theatre it was originally performed at. 2 years ago, I went to Poland for an opera. That was 3 years ago. That was the 200th anniversary of their popular composer Stanislaw Moniuszko and his opera Strasny Dvor, The Haunted Castle, and went to the Opera Theatre, which was destroyed in the war, but it's been rebuilt. And that was 2 bars, not musical bars, 2 drinking bars from a friend's apartment. And we went to the opera. One of these bars was absolutely magnificent. It was a champagne bar. And you got to open the bottle of champagne with a sword, or it's a real art.
Love it.
I love it.
My wife and I, Edwina, we wanted to go to Prague and Budapest and spend a month for our honeymoon, traveling that part of the world in the cities and then also exploring the rural areas between. And unfortunately, we were married 8 years ago, sorry, and we just didn't have the money. And since then, of course, we've had all the madness that's happened since. So it remains on the bucket list, but it is a part of the world I want to see. I am very annoyed at Game of Thrones, though, for sending all of these stupid idiot tourists to that part of the world, because they filmed a lot of the castles in Game of Thrones are from that part of the world, Transylvania and up through. And all these idiot tourists are going there wanting the tour guide to tell them all about the Game of Thrones mythology. This was the Stark's castle or this and that. No, F off, get out of my sight. I want to know the actual history of that castle. And unfortunately, the real history has been somewhat crowded out within the tourism market by people's enthusiasm for Game of Thrones. So hopefully that's settling down now. And by the time I do get there, I'll be able to enjoy a bit of real history.
Yeah, we did that when the kids were off their hands. I was the Lehrstuhl from Lagerstättenkunde at the Ludwig Maximilians Universität in Munich.
Sorry, excuse you. We don't use that sort of language. We don't use that sort of language.
It was the professor of ore deposit geology at Munich University, and that was when the big changes were taking place. And we were able to visit many of my wife's ancestral places, go to many places important in history. You could travel across to Dresden, battling the Trabants on the road, and you could go to an opera, and it would only cost you 10 marks to go to an absolutely brilliant opera. And what survived communism was actually music. People were able to express passion through classical music, all through ballet, but they couldn't express it through literature. They couldn't express it through broadcasting, but it was music that was preserved. And certain operas, which are quite seditious, could be performed. And the way in which sedition came through in music was very different from the way you'd see it performed in, say, Italy or in Australia.
Yeah, okay.
So it was very interesting how in some of these communist countries they were able to get around the system with music.
Well, there's been a lot of discussion of music in the comments. I haven't been putting them on the screen so much, but I am mostly staying across them. And there's been a lot of talk of some of Eastern Europe and Northern Europe, the Nordic countries, heavy metal music. And can I just say, for those watching, I'm a massive fan of Apocalyptica, and they are a band of foursome, a quartet of classically trained, incredibly capable, both talented and hardworking. They, people bang on far too much about talent and far too little about the amount of work that a talented person then has to do to hone their craft. These are four incredible strings players that do just phenomenal heavy metal string ensemble.
I know nothing about heavy metal, but if you want to ask me about a seditious composer who spent time in prison, as a result of that, died at 29 years old, then ask me about the Romanian composer with a wonderful name, be a great name for you to inherit. He's called Ciprian Porumbescu.
So, Ian, a question just sort of sprung to mind. Could you tell me all about was it Romanian composer Ciprian Porumbescu?
Well, very little, but he wrote a wonderful ballad for cello. Right. And if you want to listen to the saddest music ever written, listen to Ciprian Porumbescu.
No,
what
I don't.
A wonderful name.
I don't want to listen to the saddest music ever written.
Remember, he was in prison for being a freedom fighter.
Okay, yeah, okay, fair. I have a lot of sympathy for that, for strange reasons. There is a reality, though. And I'm loving this conversation, so I'm sorry to kind of bring it back to a more practical matter. But there is a reality that an appreciation of history somehow inoculates someone against a lot of these manias and fads. We've talked a lot about the green, sort of manias. Was it 1984 where the author, whatever his name was, talked about? Thank you. Orwell talked about there was no past, there was only an ever-changing present in which the party was always right. And I can't help but look at that, and that was not written about woke culture, but I cannot help but feel like it describes it perfectly, where you have to keep up with this ever-changing now, and if you don't keep up, then you're a heretic.
Well, that's very interesting, because that was quite seditious literature. It's transpired to be quite correct. It's quite scary.
Yes, sadly.
And coming back to Czechoslovakia, I had a friend from Jeseniki, right up on the Silesian border, who's since died, but he came and he was living with us in Newcastle because he had no money. And he was going through my library and he started to read Animal Farm. And he read it in one sitting overnight. And the next day, he just looked shell-shocked. He realised what this book was about and how it was a perfect description of the system he was in. And I think the writings of Aldous Huxley, George Orwell, some in that time had flirted with socialism, they'd flirted with communism. Some of them have been involved in the war in 1936 in Spain, or seeing the bombing of Galicia. These people had seen evil firsthand. And they had seen the way systems are manipulated. I saw it in a different way by being in the Soviet Union and other Eastern European countries, and then going to the Shah's Iran. I've since been to Iran in the Ayatollah's time, and I have no love of totalitarian countries, but sometimes I need to work in these places. Sure. And I think it gives you a very good insight as to some of the games that have been played at present. And we are having the salami approach. We're not having a big revolution and all of a sudden everything's changed. We're having slice by slice by slice taken, and we lose a little freedom. No worries, mate. Another freedom, no worries. Before you know where you are, you've got nothing. And that's the process we're in at present.
It's the perfect tactic, because by only taking a small slice at a time, they've got these two great weapons. Number one, anyone that speaks up and says, "Oi, no, you can't do that," they can turn around and say, "But it's such a small slice. Like, it's such a small issue. Why are you making such a big deal out of such a small issue?" And they're right. That individual slice is often a very small issue. But then the second weapon that they have by using that tactic is they can say, well, hang on, you didn't speak up when we took the last slice. Where were you then?
Right.
You're speaking up on this slice. This is only one more slice past where we were, and you didn't speak up then.
Yeah.
And this is what this is what sort of led me to near despair with all of the COVID stuff, was looking around and saying, who's with me? Who's going to join me? Who's going to help me to stand up for human rights at this time? And realizing just how many people there were who were quite happy to have yet another slice taken off them, and they weren't going to speak up, and they were using even those very arguments against me. Oh, but it's only one more. It's only closing the playgrounds.
Well, a couple of points on that. You live in Victoria, so you suffered under Andrews. I was living in Victoria in 2020, but I was in clinics all the time. But I had a real worry, because I remember the times of the morning sickness drug thalidomide.
Oh, yes.
And the effects of thalidomide on children who were born limbless.
Mm-hmm.
And after that, we had legislation worldwide where we had 10-year testing periods for new drugs.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of a sudden, we're bringing in these drugs, completely new sort of drug, to treat an excessively heavy common cold. And straight away, people are having these drugs. And I thought, well, wait a minute. That's against all the protocols that we established as a result of thalidomide. This just says danger, danger, danger to me.
You are the only other person that I've heard so far speak up about thalidomide. I do. I talk about it, and the parallels, or not the parallels directly, but the lessons learned from thalidomide that we've abandoned in our adoption of the most recent therapies. Now, I want to be very clear here. I wish that mRNA vaccines were a medical breakthrough that allowed faster, cheaper, safer development and deployment of vaccines. Nothing would make me happier. But we don't have the data that says that that's the case yet.
That's quite right.
And the early data, and it is still early, so it may not prove to be correct, but the early data is looking concerning with the excess mortality that we're now seeing in the UK, in Australia, and in other countries that are reporting the data. Other countries aren't reporting their data yet. There are certainly questions that need to be answered at the moment, and I'm not saying for sure that it is the jab. I think it's the elephant in the room that no one's allowed to talk about. But nevertheless, as you said before, you've got to go where the data leads you. You've got to be driven by science and data, not by presumption and prejudice.
Yeah.
And therefore, I remain open to the possibility that the excess mortality we're seeing isn't caused by that. But it seems like the powers that be don't want to even ask the question. They don't want to know the answer.
Yes, I heard an interview by a footballer, a soccer player from England. I've just forgotten his name. It's a French name, Matt, someone lives down in Southampton. And he was talking about the number of footballers in his day that pegged out on the field compared with the number today. And he was questioning it. Matt Letizia.
The same thing's happening with American football right now, by the way.
Yes.
There are people beginning to speak up in the media and actually say, hang on, this isn't normal.
And I also note that whether you're vaccinated or not, you can get COVID. Well, I've had it twice. And the first time I got it was before we knew COVID was around. I picked it up in South America. And I think I got the alpha version. And I just wonder why we have had all the haste. And function I was at, I spoke earlier about Noosa, at a function I was at Noosa. I was having a chat to Tony Abbott, and he said to me, look, we had, when I was Minister for Health, a plan in case we have a pandemic. And this was a plan. Letizia, thank you. Thank you, Dawn.
Browning.
Matt Letizia. I think he was played for Southampton. But anyway, I'm getting distracted. Anyway, Tony Abbott said to me, look, we had this plan for a major pandemic. And we had it all ready to go. And he said the reason why the Morrison government didn't take it on was that they panicked. Now, that was exactly the same plan that the English had. And that plan was the plan that Abbott told me was stolen by the Swedes. They stole the English plan, which was the Australian plan. And so we were already prepared We were already prepared for a pandemic, which we didn't have. We had an epidemic. We were prepared for it, and we just panicked. And that has cost us hundreds of billions. It's cost a lot of health, mental health, loss of freedoms, loss of international competitiveness. It's been appalling, the consequences of bad policy.
We've completely lost any right to criticize China, Iran, or anyone else on human rights. This for me, I mean, I was there on the front line. It's in the documentary Battleground Melbourne, battlegroundmelbourne.com.
Yes, I'm very much aware of that. Yep.
You know, we actually like, it's so much deeper than just overreacting to a virus. We gave up everything that made us unique. Our commitment to freedom, our commitment to the rule of law and basic principles, innocent until proven guilty, that you are free by default unless you're found guilty of a crime and are therefore denied that freedom on the basis of being punished for a crime. You know, whether it's freedom of speech, freedom to protest, ownership of your own property, your own business, your own car, your own house. The idea that the government was stopping children from being transported across borders in order to get medical help, and children died as a result. And the people who made the decision still have their jobs. I'm sorry, I'm going to say it. Who the fuck are we?
Yeah.
That we allowed that to happen?
I think we've completely changed the nature of what it used to be an Australian. Australians were robust, free thinkers. They were critical thinkers. I often get accused when I'm doing interviews in England or with my English friends of being very blunt. Now, that bluntness,
I like it.
We get it. We get it in outback areas and outback pubs and on stations, but you don't get it now in cities. You certainly don't get it in the mainstream media. Why you'd watch the mainstream media is beyond me. I don't. I subscribe to Foxtel, and basically I watch Sky After Dark sometimes, but not all the time, and that's it.
Even most of Sky I can't tolerate anymore.
Well, the morning is lefty stuff, and the evening, you know, they made a big mistake getting rid of Alan Jones and putting in Piers Morgan in place.
They did.
Alan Jones attracted the audience of Piers Morgan's programs are about Piers Morgan and his absolute pommy pain in the ass. But the only one who's any good is the bogan Paul Murray. But anyway, we're going right off track, which is part of what this conversation is about.
Yeah. And what is really sad is that this has become the forum. What you're looking at right now, random nobody YouTuber is now able to get guests of the caliber of Professor Ian Plimer. Why? Because he's not welcome in most other places.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Right? Like,
I'm cancelled everywhere.
I used to say to people used to challenge me, you know, way back 12, even it's pushing 13 years ago now when I first started. People used to say to me, what right do you have to be talking about water policy? What do you know? Blah, blah, blah. And I would say, honestly, I agree with you. I shouldn't exist. There shouldn't be any room for me to come in and do what I do and find an audience. But the fact that there is room for me to do this is a symptom of a very big problem where the media are simply not doing their job anymore. The media don't have to agree with you, Professor Ian Plimer, but they should be giving room for your voice. And it's only the fact that they're not doing that that then gives room for people like me to exist and to be able to do things like this.
I put the boot on the other foot. I don't search for information from mainstream media. Sure. I get it off blog sites. I get it off sites like yours. I get it off all sorts of sites. I actually do not follow mainstream media, and it actually sickens me when I see the way they behave. For example, I had Chris Smith from Sky TV ask me to watch Tanya Plibersek's National Press Club address.
Sure.
I won't mention the language I mentioned, but I did watch it and gave him various comments for his evening program. But what I noticed afterwards was there were fawning questions from journalists. There were no searching questions. There were obvious errors of fact, obvious errors of logic. For example, she was telling us how polluted Australia was. And then towards the end, she was tearfully waxing lyrical about the feeling she gets when she flies over all this national park and sees the crystal clear waters of Sydney Harbour and the clear skies. Well, hang on a tick. We're either polluted or we're not. And she was arguing that this is a wonderful country. So mainstream media, for every reason, is losing its audience because they are just full of crap, uncritical, unthinking. And a journalist's job is to dig out a story, and whether the story is right or wrong, to fearlessly ask questions. Now, we once had a public service that fearlessly was independent, and whatever the colour of the government, they would give advice. Now they're not; they are activists.
Yeah, there's a meme that goes around. I mean, memes for what they're worth, right? They're good for a giggle. But this one speaks to me. It says the news used to tell you what happened, and you had to decide what you think. Now the news tells you what to think, and you have to decide if it actually happened.
Oh yes,
and
that is worse than that. The mainstream media is just about entertainment.
Yeah,
it's entertaining people. This car was stolen and burnt out, or that pensioner was bashed up. That's not news.
Yeah. But however, to be fair, I follow a lot of different people all over the world in order to get news and information and things crossing my desk. I follow a lot of people that I disagree with. I think it's exceptionally important that we all do that.
The same.
Yep, I think it's very important. Constantly, if you ever find yourself shying away from having your beliefs challenged, that is a warning. That is a canary in the coal mine. You need to take a good look at yourself. Anyway, sidebar. However, I also follow people who would be considered, right-wing, alt-right, whatever, which I'm not, but that's what people class me as. I'm a libertarian, right? Actual right-wingers hate me, right? But I get classed as right-wing because most people don't understand what's going on.
Well, they can't argue with you, so they've got to put you in a box.
They have to throw me in a box somehow. But the problem for me is the same mistakes are being made by people on all sides. I see the same, clickbait headline, trashy non-news being pushed by right-wing sites as I see by anybody else. The ABC, classic for trashy clickbait. However, they're not unique in that. They're not uniquely bad. What we've lost is not unique to one side of politics. What we've lost is an overall cultural position. So this foundational principle that the purpose of the existence of a journalist is that you are better informed afterwards than you were before. And we've lost that now. And they're not actually trying to keep you well informed. They're trying to keep you outraged so you come back for more or what have you. And part of me just has to say, you know what? Thank you. Because it is only because of that I exist. Without them having gone off the rails the way they have, I'd still be driving forklifts for a living rather than being able to sit here and have this amazing conversation with you. And now we've got more trolls coming in on the comments, not trolls, but the spam. So I'm going to block them. Okay. Now, I'm mindful of the time. I definitely don't want to wrap you up, Professor Plimer, but
I'm in a very desperate situation at present.
Right. You need an ad break. You need an ad break.
No. I need 10 seconds to walk across to the...
Please do. No, please do. I can do elevator music with the best of them.
I've got a few more bottles here.
No, I can do elevator music with the best of them. No, you just watch. You just watch.
Look at the background. This is my downstairs study.
I've run out. I'm already out. That was the Mario theme tune.
And in case you bore me to death, I've got the whole lot here.
Being bored to death is a guarantee from me. Okay, so what do you wish every young person graduating from year 12 would know? Because I've read Green Murder, I read Heaven and Earth, I read Heaven and Hell, was it? I don't recall. I've read a number of your writings, and you're a man of deep scholarship, but you're also a man deeply practical. And I appreciate that about you, because that's a combination that's very important and very powerful and quite rare. What do you wish every single person graduating from year 12 right now understood that our education system is not currently teaching them?
I wish they could be critical thinkers based on knowledge, history, an understanding of how our systems work, our political systems. I would wish that these people could have cursive writing, could solve problems mentally, mathematical problems mentally, could actually spell, to have an absolute basic education. So in my view, a year 12 kid should be able to write, should be able to read, have read some of the classics, should be able to think, should be able to solve problems, and most of all, because it's Australia, to have a good, healthy dose of irreverence. And I think that irreverence is very important, where that's intertwined with skepticism, that's intertwined with a challenge to authority. I gave a graduation talk at St. Peter's College here in Adelaide, which is one of the very posh schools. And I was addressing the year 12 kids that were graduating, and suggested to them they probably learnt very little, and that maybe they should spend their life challenging authority. And to challenge authority, you have to have the use of the language, you have to know how numbers work, and you have to have a sense of history.
Yes.
For some reason, I haven't been invited back.
I can't think why.
But I had some of the parents come up to me afterwards and say, "Look, that was fantastic. The more of this, the better." During my, I took some extra time out at the end of my degree. There were things that I didn't know, and I wanted to learn a few more things. So I did a course in botany. I did a course in political science. I did a course in English literature. I did a course in psychology. That's where all the good-looking young girls were. And I did a course in counterpoint in music. So I did an extra year, during which time I kept myself alive by being a mathematics and science teacher.
Right.
And those were the days when there was discipline in the schools. And I think by losing a lot of discipline in the schools, we've lost respect, and we've lost the ability for kids to actually learn. Now, I've often argued that I think that kids come out of school or out of university, it's not necessary to know too much. What is necessary is how to find knowledge and to critically and analytically evaluate it. Now, a Google search is totally useless, because you've got to know what you're looking for. And then when you find it, you've got to know whether it's propaganda or whether it's real. But I do mention in this book of mine that, if people are saying, "Oh, we're all doomed and we're getting more hurricanes than we've ever had before," a 30-second Google search on your mobile phone, and you would see that that's wrong. So, unfortunately, we live in an electronic world, and kids have relied on their mobile phones as the font of everything. And we now no longer have children leaving school or leaving university where they have to commit a large volume of knowledge to memory. But the most important things are to be literate, to be numerate, to have an understanding of literature and history, and to be a critical and analytical thinker.
So I describe it as this, and I'm realizing I'm missing something. So thank you for that reply, because you're provoking my thinking. I was homeschooled myself, and so I speak on homeschooling from time to time. People want me to talk about that and my background and everything else. And previously, what I've said is you need three things in order to be a competent human being who can find their way in the world and have a successful life, whatever that means for you. I've previously said you need three things. You need mastery of numbers, mastery of words, and mastery of relationships. And if you have those three competencies, you will find success, whatever that means for you. But I think actually I'm missing something. I think what I'm missing is history. I think there is a minimum level. It doesn't necessarily have to be mastery, but there has to be an appreciation of history, because that's what gives context to so much of the rest of what you learn.
But
And I
history is
didn't.
also about humans, about their relationships.
Sure.
And history is intertwined with archaeology. It's intertwined with geology. In fact, I wrote a book about the Greek island of Milos,
Mm,
intertwining geology, history, and archaeology. And all
mm,
the great historic and archaeological events took
mm.
place because of a geological event. So
Right.
the past tells us a lot, and you can learn a lot about the past from reading literature.
Mm,
There are really important books to read. Now, Richard
mm,
Dawkins, a well-known atheist, argues that
mhm.
people should read the King James edition of the Bible,
Sure.
and
Yeah.
his reason for that is that is beautiful English.
Mm,
He doesn't view it as being a chronicle of previous times and how
sure.
it's a documentation of experiences and people trying to get an understanding of the world. So
Mm,
I'm a great believer in people learning about the past
mm. Yeah. Look, I think in
from
future,
history, from geology, from literature,
yeah,
whatever.
in future talks, I think I'm going to have to add an appreciation of history to my basic, not 3, but now 4 competencies that are necessary. And yes, so I didn't realize that we had Ross Cameron watching. I was with Ross just this last weekend, actually. But this must be Ross under an alias. Benjamin Robson must be fake. It must be Ross Cameron, because Ross Cameron cannot give a single
I know,
sentence
without talking about Marcus Aurelius,
without
can't possibly do
mentioning
it.
Marcus Aurelius. And so, therefore, Benjamin Robson, your cover has been blown. You are Ross Cameron. My eldest has Meditations by Marcus Aurelius on her reading list. Every student should have read that by the time they graduate year 12.
That's not even an anagram of Ross Cameron.
No, it's not. It's not, is it? It's they've just picked something completely random. You know what? I've not actually read that, and I should add that to my list. Someone mentioned earlier in the slow chat when I was holding up all the different books, a book club with Topher Field. But you know what? Maybe that's not a terrible idea. Maybe because there's a lot of books I should have read that I haven't yet. So maybe we should actually like have a book club and we all get the same book and read it and talk about it once a month or something.
Well,
I
I've
don't know.
given
I
you a
don't know.
good one, The Good Soldier Shrek. Read that.
Yes.
I
Yes.
mean,
Yeah.
it's a
Yeah.
comedy. It's a very, very funny book, and it
Okay.
finishes in the middle of nowhere because he died in the middle of writing it. They never know how it's going to end.
That's classic. I've often thought if I ever become a fiction writer, and I do have a particular fiction book that I do want to write before I die, what I want to do is I want to release it and not tell anybody, but have 6 different endings, right, in the book. And I
Yes.
hope I'm very old. I hope I'm very, very old when this happens, right? So I just tell everybody, yeah, here's my book. There you go. Yes, I'll sign it. Thank you very much. And very, very quickly online, people are going to start arguing with each other about how the book ended. And they'll all be right. And they're all telling each other that each other is wrong. And then I'll let it all fulminate and I'll let the argument rage for about a month. And then I'll finally come clean. And having published 6 endings, I'll come clean by saying, you know what, you're absolutely right. I've been screwing with you all. I've published 7 different endings to the book. And then watch them all tear each other apart as they hunt for the copy of the book that has that 7th ending that doesn't exist. I have childish ambitions. I realize
I think to write fiction would be very, very hard. I write using my knowledge. I would find it very, very hard to write a novel.
I actually got 300,000 words in to a very substantial trilogy of books called The Chronicles of Aliat. And unfortunately, that fell by the wayside about 11 years ago, roughly actually the same time as I really started to make more videos as Topher. But I used to be a forklift driver, and I would drive the forklift, and I would enjoy imagining and writing stories in my head. And at the end of the day, the stories would all disappear from my imagination and my memory, and they'd be gone. And then I began to actually start to more intentionally put those stories together. And then I'd go home at night and I'd begin writing. And that was born. That was where the Chronicles of Aliat were born. And I have an ambition that before I die, I will finish that. And I don't care whether anyone else buys it. I will have a leather-bound copy that has in gold embossing the Chronicles of Aliat on the front. And that will be on my coffee table in my house when I die. That's my ambition for that. I have no dreams of being some big famous author, but that it's finished, or not finished, but that it reaches the point where I publish it and put it on my coffee table. All right. So how in the world are we going to move ahead, Professor? Given the level of division, you've got these people who are deeply entrenched on the climate change catastrophe side of things. You've got people like you and I who are deeply entrenched on the other side of things and very much capitalists and believers in human capital and that the human mind can solve so many of the problems that we face. How do we find a way to move ahead? Politically, they're always siding with the catastrophist side of things. How do we change that?
Well, I think there are two things. The only good politician is a frightened politician, and you've got to scare them. And the second thing is that once politicians get mocked, they've lost it. And you've got to constantly mock them on their comments and their decisions. Like, for example, Tanya Plibersek telling us about the feeling she gets when she flies into Sydney, obviously from an international flight, something that a very large number of people don't do. They can't do because they can't afford it. But she does. And she tells us how wonderful and clean and pristine it is. And she's also telling us how dreadfully polluted we are. You've just got to mock them. And once people are laughing at you as a politician, there is no return. You're finished.
Yeah. Well, look, I think that's a good observation. And you know what? I actually need to take a bit of a bladder break here. So speaking of mocking, what I'd like to do is actually play a video that I made with Rukshan Fernando. Do you know who Rukshan is, Ian?
No, I don't.
So Rukshan is a chap. He's of Sri Lankan extraction, Australian guy. He's a wedding videographer. And when all the protests kicked off, he...
Oh, yes, now I know. Yes, now I know. Yes. Yes.
So he and I have teamed up, and later or early next week, you'll see the second of this series come out. But we released a teaser last week of a new series of videos, very much in the spirit of Clark and Dorr. You'd surely be familiar with Clark and Dorr.
Yes.
So in the spirit of Clark and Dorr, it's only about 90 seconds long, which means this is going to have to be a very, very fast loo break on my part here. However, I am just going to call up. I'm just going to grab a video file. And find Clark and not Clark and Dorr, Topher and Rukshan.
Victorian Health Minister.
All right, now there we go. And look, enjoy this for about 90 seconds and then come back. We're going to talk nuclear power. We're going to talk about the future and what could we actually do to get from where we are to where we ought to be to make the future a better place. And we're going to do that in probably not 90 seconds because I can't be that fast, but we're going to do that in a couple of minutes' time. Stick around.
I'm going to have an 88-second break.
You do that.
Welcome.
Health Minister today, Rukshan. I just need to make that clear.
Are you trying to distance yourself from... Joining me today is the Victorian Health Minister. Minister, welcome.
Health Minister today, Rukshan. I just need to make that clear.
Are you trying to distance yourself from the actions of your predecessors?
That is not what I said. That is not an accurate reflection of what was said.
Then what did you say?
I don't recall.
Minister, the Victorian government have maintained that their COVID policy was based on the science.
The science.
Yes, that's what I said, the science.
The science.
But it's fair to say that the people of Victoria haven't actually been allowed to see the science.
The science.
How can they be confident that policy decisions going forward will be based on science?
No, it's not based on science, Rukshan. It's based on the science. The science. Are you not doing it, Rukshan?
Doing what?
Are you not a believer, Rukshan?
In what?
In the science, Rukshan! The science.
Well, it's hard to believe in it when you're actually not allowed to see it.
Well, that's where faith comes in, Rukshan. We have seen the science. You just have to believe the science.
That's not how science works.
Of course not.
You agree that's not how science works?
We're not talking about science here, Rukshan. We're talking about the science.
What exactly is the science?
The science. It is whatever we say it is, Rukshan. That's why you just have to believe it.
Why would I believe it?
Because if you don't, we'll beat the shit out of you, Rukshan. You were there, Rukshan. Of all people, you would know, Rukshan.
Minister for Health, thank you for your time.
My pleasure. Not an accurate reflection of what was said.
Then what did you say?
I don't recall. We'll beat the shit out of you, Rukshan. I thought you of all people would know that, Rukshan. You were there, Rukshan.
I didn't even see that line.
Seamless. I'm back. 90 seconds, and I made it. And so did Professor Ian Plimer. Well done, mate. That was like a Formula One pit stop. That was really quick.
Yes, tyres changed, everything ready.
All right. So I promised someone earlier who was asking questions that
About nuclear.
About nuclear, that I would pick your brain about nuclear. Where are we at with that? I'm sure you're across this better than I am. There are new generations of reactors coming out. There are modular reactors. As I understand it, there are reactors that it can sort of fit on the back of a truck almost. Where are we at with nuclear today?
Well, I can remember as a school child being taken to the Lucas Heights reactor.
Yes.
And that was in the bush. Greatest thing since sliced bread. It was built there so the short-lived medical isotopes could be transported to Sydney Kingston to Smith Airport.
Yep.
And go to the Pacific Islands or to Broome or Darwin and have not decayed very much. Mm-hmm. Since then, of course, there's been an encroachment of housing and people are now objecting to a nuclear reactor being there. It's only a 20 megawatt opal reactor. But if you've ever had cancer, you cannot object to nuclear power because a neutron source provides us with the medical isotopes, and a very large number of people in our country get cancer. They must be great supporters of nuclear.
You would
we had, under Prime Minister Gorton, plans to build a nuclear reactor at Jervis Bay. The foundations are still there. I'm a little bit suspicious about how that process was reversed. The people are still alive, so I won't say their names. But we could have been a nuclear country.
Yeah.
We export some 6,000 tons of uranium in yellowcake. And this is used by many, many countries to generate electricity. However, we deem it immoral to use the same yellowcake to generate electricity ourselves in our own country.
Yeah.
The thorium reactors are touted as being the next generation. They have some advantages in that thorium is far more abundant than uranium. We have a hell of a lot of thorium minerals sitting right at the surface in mineral sands all around Australia. And India has thorium reactors. Thorium doesn't produce daughter isotopes that you can use to make a plutonium or uranium bomb. So,
which, as I understand it, Professor, that was the reason why uranium was preferred in the first place, was because it could generate the isotopes necessary for nuclear weapons.
Well, I suspect so. However, there is a whole technology now built around uranium and around fission decay of uranium. That technology is very hard when a new one comes along like thorium.
Sure.
We're now into about fourth or fifth generation of nuclear reactors. They are far more efficient, smaller, compact, and sealed. These reactors we've had for a long period of time in submarines, in warships, and these small modular reactors are now almost at the stage where you can go to Bunnings and buy one made by Hitachi or General Electric or Rolls-Royce. Now, these fit on a B-double. We've got enormous use for these in Australia. There are mines that might have a mining life of 20 or 50 years. You truck it in there, use it to generate the 60 megawatts that you need. When the mine closes, you shift it to somewhere else. When you have finished using that, it goes back to the manufacturer. You don't open it. You don't have access to any of the fissionable material. In this country, we have missed, I think, one of the greatest economic opportunities that we have been gifted.
Right.
We cannot compete with manufacturing because of our high costs. But there's one thing we can compete on is energy. We export a huge amount of coal. It earns just a little bit more money than iron. And the other great industry which is waiting to grow in this country is a cradle-to-grave nuclear industry. And that is where we would mine the uranium. We then create the yellow cake. From that, we make the fuel rods, which then we might lease out to, say, Korea or Japan.
The whole world.
Then we bring them back to the whole world. We bring them back to Australia, clean them up. lease them out again, and each step you can hear the cash register ringing.
Mhm.
And so that is an industry which in the 1970s was calculated to be worth $5,000 per man, woman, and child in Australia. It's probably
Yeah,
five times that now.
Yeah.
And that would give us a complete new high specialist industry. Hanging off that industry would be a lot of engineering works. Hanging off that industry would be a lot of skilled people. And that industry could very easily take place in the state that I currently live in, South Australia, because it's a desert that's inhabited by 1.5 million people. There's plenty of isolated areas. We've got an old uranium mine like Radium Hill, if there's any necessity to put waste product there. We've got operating uranium mines, which are very deep, where we could stope fill. We could put in the any waste fill. To me, that is the obvious step that this country has to have. And we have, I think, the opportunity to be very sensible about energy, using things like wind and solar in isolated areas, such for train signals or for telephone boxes where you don't need a lot of grunt. Using gas in areas such as Western Australia and southeastern Australia, where we've got a lot of gas, using coal in places like Queensland, and using uranium as 24/7 energy. We can't really think about hydro because we're a dry continent. We don't have a great topography. And to me, we have the sites already for the reactors. In South Australia, we've flattened 2 coal-fired power stations. We've got the high voltage lines still there. We just put a nuclear reactor right there. Now, nuclear reactors live in the middle of cities already.
Yes.
And these new generation nuclear reactors are the obvious way to go. So my view is we become the Saudi Arabia of the nuclear industry. We are a democratic country. We can control every atom of uranium, and we would create employment that would go forever. I can't see why we can't do it. Just because Greens squawk doesn't mean you should listen to them.
I couldn't agree more. People say, "Oh, would you want that built in your backyard?" I would happily live in a house that backs onto a nuclear reactor. Number one, they're surrounded by an enormous amount of parkland, greenland, etc., as a buffer zone. Ordinarily, there are some exceptions, but most of the time, there's an enormous amount there. Number two, there is no place on Earth that is being more carefully observed and watched and measured and scrutinized than a nuclear power plant. Every single second, there are measurements being taken by instruments that will ring alarms the minute something is wrong in so many different ways. People talk about Chernobyl. Do some research. Chernobyl was a disaster made of human arrogance because they didn't shut it down and follow procedures when they should have. People talk about Fukushima. Fukushima is an example of just how incredibly robust and safe nuclear technology is. An earthquake followed by a tsunami, and still not a single person died of radiation. Right?
You've got no argument. I agree with both points.
I would happily live next door to a nuclear power plant.
Yeah, I'm quite happy to do it. And quite happy.
Do you think it's politically possible, though? The conversation is happening, but do you think it's realistically politically possible for us to allow nuclear in this country?
I think the only political possibility is in this state of South Australia. I'm not a South Australian. I've just parked here, and it would only happen with a Labor government.
Really?
Oh, yes. And I think that is the only possibility if you had a Labor government go for a reactor. And the reason for that is that South Australia is at the end of the line. We don't have coal-fired power. Our coal-fired power comes from Queensland. We have gas. That comes from the Cooper Basin. But we're at the end of the line. If Queensland coughs, we have no power. Our batteries will keep us going for a few minutes. And ultimately the crunch will come. Now, in this house just over there, about 3 metres from me, is a 13.5 kVA gas generator. That's for a very good reason. We have blackouts. I live in South Australia. For medical reasons for my wife, I need a generator. Now, that to me is the most likely scenario that a Labor government in this state would do it.
Okay.
The last Liberal government wet the bed so much it became so sloppy they couldn't even climb out of it. So, and the right wing of the Labor government in South Australia is a bit pragmatic.
You've got to tell me more. I'm with Paul here because in Victoria, the Liberal Party is utterly useless. I despise Daniel Andrews. I despise the Labor Party. But
And
I
what
have
about
no
Matthew
respect
Guy's
or time for the Liberals.
emissions figure? I mean, come on.
Let's not go there because I will just get angry and I will do something.
Well, you've got one good one. Is Tim Smith.
Yeah, sort of,
Yeah.
if you can stay off the source. Okay, but Paul is quite
Excuse me,
right.
I'll have a drink.
Paul's got, like, hey, there's nothing wrong with getting on the source. Just don't get behind the wheel of a car afterwards. So talk to me a little bit. I'm fascinated by politics far more than I should be. I have an unhealthy obsession with it. You specifically said Labor government.
Yes.
Why?
The Catholic right wing of Labor in South Australia is more conservative than any conservative group I've seen in my voting lifetime.
Interesting.
They are pragmatic, practical people who are concerned with the welfare of the electorate. Most politicians I've met, and I know quite a few personally, and I've had a few students become politicians, they are concerned about the next election. They are not concerned about the welfare of the people. Sure. If someone has been brought up with a good religious background, and the Catholic right wing is where they hide in the Labor Party, they are the ones that are pragmatic.
Okay. Wow. Interesting. Okay. I wouldn't have picked that, but then again, I mean, the Liberal Party are worse than useless. So in a sense, it kind of makes sense that the conservative end of the Labor Party might be more useful. Interesting. Okay. So without wanting to be morbid, Professor, and I'm heading towards wrapping up here. And I'm more than happy for us to keep going. But
I've still got a couple of bottles to go.
No, that's right. But in terms of the things that I actually actively wanted to pick your brain over, where we're approaching the end of that, and I'm more than happy just to shoot the breeze after.
Yeah, you're in charge. You run it.
No. So you've outed yourself as being 75, nearly 76. You've had a tremendous career and left a tremendous heritage in all of the books that you've written that will, without being morbid, will live on well beyond you. What? And I'm asking this, sorry, for context, I'm asking this as a 40-year-old man who has found that fate or life or God or whatever you want to blame has sort of singled me out to be a political commentator. It seems that that's my fate. It seems that I can't get away from it. And to try and make the world a better place somehow through what I do. What would be your ideal legacy? What would you want people to remember? Professor Ian Plimer. Yes, I remember him. This is what I remember.
He gave the cage a bloody good rattle. I've had an incredible life. I was born on the wrong side of the tracks. My father was an invalid. My mother had to go out and work. The only way I could get to university was to win a scholarship. I had some wonderful mentors as a child, and as a university student. These mentors later I was able to pay back and actually published with two of them, actually. I have something that can't be taken away from me, and it's an education. I've had a life where I've been a school teacher, worked in the exploration and mining industry, worked in universities, written books, done quite a bit of broadcasting. And I guess the greatest thing is I'm alive. I've survived 2 helicopter crashes. I've survived a jet aeroplane that ran out of fuel at 31,000 feet and we crashed. And I'm currently in the process of surviving cancer. So I'm not saying I'm bulletproof, but
no, stop.
Nothing affects me.
You can't say that and then just move on. You can't say I've survived 2 helicopter crashes and a jet that ran out of fuel at 31,000 feet. By the way, that's very negligent on the part of the pilots.
Oh, it's criminal negligence.
And then just move on. You've got to, I've been in a helicopter one time. Now, I will say,
they're built to kill you.
I'm going to name drop here. I was in a helicopter that was piloted by none other than Dick Smith in person.
I've been with Dick Smith in helicopters.
And it was just you and me
last Friday. He was at Arkaroola. Okay. He was checking whether I was in Broken Hill. I wasn't.
So Dick and I disagree on many, many things, but I will say this for Dick Smith. He puts his money where his mouth is. There is no guile. There is no deception. He means what he says what he means, and he's willing to back it up with his own money. So Dick rang me about 11 years ago. And again, and same with Christopher Monckton. I pick up the phone, I hear this voice. Hi, this is Dick Smith. And I'm like, you're either a very good impersonator or you are actually Dick Smith. And it was the real Dick Smith. And he wanted to know if I knew about his Wilberforce Award. Now, the Wilberforce Award was an award that he offered to someone under 30 years of age. He was offering $1 million if they were willing to be the face of his campaign, warning about the dangers of a big Australia. Right? Now, he did a documentary, he wrote a book, etc. He did his best to communicate on that subject. He felt that his efforts weren't cutting through, and this was his solution. Offer $1 million to someone under 30 who could be the face of that campaign. And he rang me, and look, you know Dick, so you can ring him and verify this for yourself. But I do not believe it is a stretch to say that he rang me to offer me the Wilberforce Award, to offer me $1 million. He said to me, I've found my guy. I've found the person who I believe should be the face of my campaign, and there's $1 million in it for you. And I, as a 29-year-old man at the time, found myself saying, you know what, Dick, that's very interesting. I don't think you're right about the dangers of a big Australia, but for $1 million, I'll have another look at it. And so he was very gracious, and he paid, and he flew me up to Sydney, and we spent a day together. We flew in his jet out to regional New South Wales, where there was an event happening that he had to be at. Then he flew the plane out there, and then he had his pilot fly the plane back, and we spoke. And it became very clear in the first half hour or so that our differences were pretty much intractable. I wasn't going to come around to his point of view. And as much as he tried, I listened, I did listen, and I did my best, but I just couldn't bring myself to agree with his perspective. However, he remained an absolute gentleman. He brought me back to his house. We landed at Bankstown Airport. We jumped out of his jet. We got into his helicopter. He flew me to his house.
And went up to Terry Hills, yes.
We landed in his driveway, which is a surreal experience. And then we spoke for another hour and a half or so inside his house. And then at the end, he actually gave me a video camera and a tripod. A tripod that I use to this day, by the way, that he no longer had use for. And he gave them to me, knowing at that point that I wasn't accepting. I wasn't going to be the face of his campaign. He remains an absolute gentleman. And he's someone that, despite some very significant and strong disagreements with how he sees the world, I consider to be an absolute gentleman.
He's one of Australia's great people. Yeah. When I fly with him, we argue the whole time. The trip goes very quickly. Dick and I used to take 40 school kids up to Arkaroola Wilderness Sanctuary.
Yeah, right.
And inculcate them about the outback, the environment. He would talk to them about responsible risk-taking and give them a story about how he circumnavigated the globe single-handed in a helicopter, which is a hair-raising story. And that jet that you flew in to regional New South Wales, that was his citation. It was a Cessna citation, was the one I crashed in. That was my last day with one particular mining company, and that was sorry. I decided that maybe I should go into academia.
I want to be really clear here. Was it Dick Smith's citation that ran
out of 31,000? No. Dick would never do that.
No. I was going to say that seems extraordinary.
Yeah. So he's very much aware of the aeroplane VHB&Q that came in. He's very much aware of the history of it. He keeps telling me I'm lucky to be alive, which I think I am. But he's a great Australian. I disagree with him on his population ideas. I disagree with him on many things. But he is a gentleman. In fact, he did something on ABC Radio, which someone recorded and gave to me, pointing out that he does disagree with me, but we are good friends. He wanted to catch up with me in Broken Hill last week. He was coming through with his wife, Pip, and Greg Mortimer. Greg is the first Australian to have climbed Mount Everest.
Okay.
And I taught Greg in the late 60s, early 70s as a student of mine at Macquarie University. I wanted to see Greg, but I wanted to get back to Australia, back to Adelaide, because I'll be in Broken Hill in a couple of days' time. I'm commuting there at present. So I couldn't catch up with him. But he's a great Australian, a great explorer, a great thinker. a
Yep.
great inspirer. If you want young people to have their life changed, introduce them to Dick Smith.
And he turned around, he said, you know what, we need more Australian-made food. So what did he do? He started Dick Smith Foods,
Yes.
where he was
Yes.
trying to put Australian-made produce on the shelves. And he discovered a very unfortunate and very harsh truth, which is that Australians will say that they want Australian-made food. And the moment you tell them that it's going to cost them $1 more for their peanut butter or $2 more for their strawberry jam, all of a sudden they change their mind.
Yes.
But again, he put his money where his mouth is. There is no guile. There is no deception. I disagree with him
Not at all. He's
fundamentally on so many things. But boy, could we do with more Dick Smiths.
Oh, yes. A few weeks ago, I read his biography. Great book, great read. Really great read. He's a great speaker. And together with a couple of school teachers, we used to bring 40 disturbed kids from Adelaide and have a week in the outback and have them reading the land and working out how the world works.
Yep.
And Dick would always come in and support me. It probably cost him $50,000 to fly in there, and both Dick and I would fund this for the kids. And he's just a great Australian.
Yeah,
not many of them around.
Would you be so kind as to remember me to Dick Smith? And we haven't spoken in some years, but even many years past where I knocked him back and I said, you know what, I don't want your $1 million. I'm not going to be your face of that campaign. He remained an absolute gentleman. When I called him, he would pick up the phone. And I haven't called him in many years.
You could have taken $1 million and run and been deceptive, etc. But you've got to live with yourself.
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. I can't buy back my integrity. That was exactly the argument that I was having with myself on the flight from Sydney back to Melbourne. As I'm coming back as a 29-year-old broke, man driving a forklift for a living, having just knocked back $1 million and arguing with myself about it. And just having to go, you know what? I can't buy back my integrity. I cannot buy back my own respect for myself. No. It'll never happen.
And he would have valued that. He would have appreciated that.
I believe he did. I believe he did, and that's why he remained incredibly friendly and incredibly responsive to me in the years since. And then ultimately, I ran out of reasons to talk to him, so we haven't spoken for some years.
He's of the stage where he's interested, or he's always been interested in the welfare of Australia. Sure. There may well be a film venture that you could do with him. He's very much interested in how the outback has shaped thinking in Australia. He's very much interested in the explorers, very much interested in our river systems and our outback. So, he's a great man.
All right. So how about we finish on this? Would you, as we approach the 3-hour mark, would you regale me with the story of your 2 helicopter crashes? Because I've had 1 helicopter experience with Dick Smith, and it was phenomenal. And I cannot wait to get back in a helicopter again. It was just utterly amazing. It was the most amazing way to travel.
Well, I've flown with Dick in his helicopter. I think the last time was we flew from his place in, I think we went from Terry Hills up to Gyra in the New England and back. We couldn't land at Gyra because of a very low fog, and we came and landed at Armidale and then drove on up to Gyra. And I'll fly anywhere with Dick, someone who flies single-handed around the world in a helicopter. If he says we can't land at Gyra, we don't land at Gyra.
Yep, 100%.
The first one was in 1967. It was a Bell G2A in the Pilbara in summertime.
I'm not trying to start an argument, but that was 15 years before I was born. just wanted to throw that in.
And it was very hot weather. We ran out of fuel, and they auto rotate down, but in the hot weather they hit the ground very hard.
Do they?
The second one was it would have been late 70s in Fiji. And took off and clipped the top of a tree and flipped the chopper and dropped upside down into the drink. And so you always think about fuel and fuel catching alight. You also think about internal injuries. And with the Cessna Citation that ran out of fuel and crashed, I wrote that up as a story in the Spectator, and so
listeners
can look at it. It's called Skid Marks in the Desert, And Rowan Dean gave me an extra page, and I went through the 9 mistakes that the single pilot made. And I'll never fly in a single pilot jet again. I might not have a choice. The Flying Doctor has single pilot jets, but I will never fly in a single pilot jet. He made 9 consecutive mistakes. Wow. He could have at any time turned around, and it was the most frightening experience you can have to hear both those engines flame out. And we had a cloud base of about 600 foot, been very, very heavy rain. We were going to try to put the plane on the Commonwealth Railway track, which was instant death. But at the last minute, saw
a jet on a railway track.
Yeah.
How is that even an idea?
Well, there's no choice. But the cloud broke open a little bit, and passenger up the front said over there, and there was a fire break that had been cut on a station at Bulong, east of Kalgoorlie. And so, I mean, you've got no flaps. You can't get the undercarriage down. We came in and hit the ground. It's a noise I'll never forget, with the fuselage peeling off underneath. We skidded for about 400 metres and slowed down quite a bit before we started to collect a few trees, but we'd slowed down enough. Anyway, on that station, that fire break had been cut in only a couple of weeks before. And I know the station owner. He's a chap called John Jones. And whenever I see John in Perth, he'll say, you still haven't paid up for parking on my property. I say, John, you haven't paid me for the ploughing we did. We cut a 400-metre trench on your place. And then he'll say, by God, you were lucky. And we were. We shouldn't have lived. You don't walk away from a jet that crashes in the bush. So that was a great stroke of luck. That has changed my whole perspective on safety. I spent a lot of my time previous to that, and I was underground last week at Broken Hill. I'll be underground next week. So I have a very different view on safety to other people. And you don't put your life in the hands of a fuckwit. You just don't do it. You really have to assess the personality of someone who's going to fly you. And this is why Dick Smith, you'll travel anywhere with Dick.
Look, I would put my life in Dick Smith's hands any day of the week. He says, don't put your life in the hands of a fuckwit, but he still came on my show, ladies and gentlemen. He is a man of great faith. Can I just say that's phenomenal. But the question that comes to my mind, and I'm sorry, because I should be more concerned about the humans and less concerned about the machinery. But the question that comes to my mind is the wreckage of that plane still sitting there?
No, the plane was pulled apart and used for parts in the Philippines.
Right, okay.
Everything they tell you about safety, it doesn't work. Everything falls apart and projects up into the cockpit. None of the emergency doors could be opened. You could only get out of the main door, which came off anyway.
Wow.
I'm a very lucky person. So with this cancer battle I'm having at present, that's passé. I'm in control.
Mate, I think that is a fantastic note to end the chat on. This has been such a pleasure. 3 hours of non-stop fun. Professor Ian Plimer, ladies and gentlemen, what a gentleman, what a great show, what the depth of knowledge and scholarship, your willingness to spend the time sharing with us. Ian, I'm so deeply, deeply grateful. Hayley King says it. One of the best slow chats ever. Thank you so much to you both. So much respect. 100%.
Thank you for having me.
No, look, it's absolutely my pleasure. I am going to hassle you for introductions and people that I do want to interview in the future. We've got an amazing, amazing lineup for you for the rest of the year on Slow Chats, all the way through from now until the end of the year. And I hope to improve that lineup even further, thanks to the help of Professor Plimer. But can I just say thank you so much? I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I've thoroughly enjoyed reading this. Guys, get yourself a copy. Get yourself a copy of Green Murder by Professor Ian Plimer. This is, don't be intimidated. It's 550, 60 odd pages. Don't be intimidated. It is incredibly easy to read. Just wonderful, wonderful literature where it is both the scholarship involved, but also the ease of reading and the use of language is a rare combination, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. So, Professor Plimer, thank you.
Thank you for having me, and thank you, viewers.
Yes, thank you. Everyone that's commented, really appreciate it. And we will see you again next week. Stand by. I'll be announcing early in the new week who my guest is for next week. You're going to love it. Thanks. Bye.